Story 1. I leave this as a warning. I strongly advise you not to visit wellness retreat in the Pacific Northwest. The cult, or coven, whatever they were, cast some kind of spell on us. Their elder vomited something black and vile into my girlfriend's mouth. Things got much, much worse from there. We arrived on the first day at wellness retreat, and I remember how the weight of city life seemed to melt away. Aubrey and I had long dreamed of such a vacation, a retreat in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, where forests merged majestically with the ocean and nature itself promised healing. The stress of the past months, the busy schedules, the sleepless nights, all this was left behind. We needed time to get rid of excess fatigue and clear our heads, and this retreat seemed like the perfect place to do it. When we arrived at first, everything looked just as I had imagined. Green expanses in which old pines and cedars were visible under a light fog, and the air was filled with a resinous pine scent that I could not help but admire. Everything was so calm that it seemed that even the birds could not disturb this harmonious peace. This corner of nature was exactly what Aubrey had dreamed of, and she led us with a smile through the threshold of one of the main buildings of the complex, an unusual yurt. The yurt where the classes were held looked strange, as if everything there had been built with some ancient meaning. The walls of intertwined branches and earth gave the feeling that you were in the heart of the forest, and nothing in the world could disturb you. Candles burned inside, and their light danced on the walls, creating the effect of a living aura. The doors to the yurt opened onto a winding path leading into the forest, which, although it seemed quite peaceful, had something disturbing about it. We entered, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not pleasant, but somehow specific. A dark liquid, the smell of which I could not immediately identify, hung in the air. But even stranger was the woman who met us in the center of the hall. Her gaze was piercing, as if she could read my thoughts and see what was going on in my soul. Her white long hair fell to her waist, and her skin was so pale that it seemed almost sickly. I felt uncomfortable but tried to hide it. Soon we were seated, and all attention was on the elder. She began the ceremony with the drink that was offered to me. The tea, dark brown and thick, was not just a drink, but something mystical. My hand holding the cup trembled slightly. I took a deep breath before taking a sip. Instantly, my entire throat was filled with an unbearable burning sensation. It was not just unpleasant. I felt as if the liquid was burning me from the inside, as if it was penetrating every cell of my body. Aubrey drank her tea first, and I saw her face twist at the unpleasant taste. But she said nothing. She was always stoic, but something in her eyes betrayed the worry she was hiding. We walked toward the center, where the elder began to chant. Her voice was hoarse and monotone, making sounds that seemed unnatural. When she raised the cup and spoke to the sky, the air grew heavy, and my body felt as if all the oxygen had left the room. The chanting of the guests was strange and intense. I felt the walls of the place, as if pierced by a cold, begin to squeeze me. I noticed how the air began to thicken, as if something invisible was hanging over us, wrapping itself around every cell of my body. My body responded with panic, and I tried to distract myself by glancing at Aubrey. She sat across from me, still unaware that what was happening around her was no longer a normal ritual. Suddenly, something interrupted the ritual. A gust of wind blew out the candles. In the darkness, in the dim light, I saw Aubrey's eyes begin to roll back in her head. Her body began to shake, and suddenly she fell to the floor, foam coming out of her mouth. I jumped up, trying to approach, but something held me back. My legs wouldn't move, even though I tried to step toward her. The elder, her eyes absolutely wild, leaned down and grabbed Aubrey by the face. I couldn't contain my horror as her lips stretched into an unnatural smile. I tried to scream, but my voice faded before it reached my ears. I watched as she absorbed everything that was happening to Aubrey. With each sip of the black liquid, she became less and less human, and Aubrey became more and more lifeless. And in that moment, I realized that we had gone too far. We weren't just in a remote place. We were in the territory of something very dangerous. Something dark and ancient that didn't tolerate strangers. Something that had prevented me from saving my girl. And now that I saw her again, it was too late. This was my first chapter, an introduction to the nightmare that was starting to unfold around us. I didn't know what was coming, but every moment was filled with anxiety. That same viscous, deep anxiety that grew with each passing day, with each new step in this ominous place. Losing time was not what I felt when I found myself in this place. I didn't know what scared me more, what I saw with my own eyes, or what I couldn't explain. After Aubrey lost consciousness, she was brought back to her senses only by the elder, making several signs that were completely incomprehensible to me. Some kind of amulet appeared in her hands, sparkling like frozen gold, and her voice sounded with such a commanding tone that it seemed the whole world around us froze. She whispered something that was impossible to understand and then placed her hands on my girl's forehead. It was all so strange and unbelievable that I could hardly believe it. But when Aubrey opened her eyes, there was no fear or confusion in her gaze, only a strange, empty expression. She looked at me as if I were someone else. I didn't recognize her eyes. The elder had said that everything would be fine, that Aubrey just needed time to recover from the shock, but I felt that something was wrong. I tried to regain her attention, but her eyes were empty, as if she were far, far away from me. I asked her to stand up, but she remained sitting, frozen, and her silence became more and more oppressive. I had to ask what was going on, but I held back. Fear was creeping in with each passing moment, because I was beginning to understand that, despite the outward appearance of a retreat, I was in a place where others ruled, where the healing was not about just resting, but about not knowing what I was up against. These people, this cult, they weren't looking for enlightenment. They were looking for something else. Several hours passed and I still had no answer. Aubrey sat silently, lost in her own thoughts, showing no signs of getting better. So I decided to talk to one of the retreatants, a man who seemed less mysterious than the elder. He told me that everything would be fine, but that I had to understand that people here weren't just looking for relaxation or healing. This place, he said, was for those who were seeking to discover something more. He said it with such reproach that I felt a tension inside. Everything around me felt alien, and I wanted to leave this place as quickly as possible, but I couldn't leave Aubrey alone. Meanwhile, all this uncertainty did not leave me. My girlfriend and I decided to stay the night, hoping that her condition would improve, but something happened that I could not predict. At midnight, I was awakened by a strange sound. It came from the depths of the forest, from the dark corners where the moonlight did not penetrate. At first, I thought it was just the noise of nature, the sounds of the night. But the longer I listened, the more terrified I became. It was something else, not just the rustling of leaves, but something sinister, as if breathing and watching. I got out of bed, threw on some clothes, and went outside. The forest was dark, but the air was filled with that strange, piercing smell as always. I could barely hear any footsteps or the sound of the wind, only this indescribable sound that beckoned me deeper into the forest. That's when I felt her. It was not Aubrey, but something that had taken her form. When I returned to the room, I saw her sitting up, but her eyes were completely lifeless. It was like when you realize in a nightmare that the person in front of you is not the one you loved. She was smiling, but it was not her smile. It was the smile of the creature that wore her face. I couldn't get a word out. As I approached her, she held out her hand to me. Not the hand I knew, but a strange one, cold as stone. I felt a pressure in the air. The creature she had become was moving slowly toward me, and I could do nothing but try to understand what was happening. I felt myself being pulled into the dark depths, and I knew I couldn't let her go, even if she was no longer my Aubrey. As I tried to grab her, her body suddenly went soft and limp, like death. I smelled the sharp smell of rot and decay, and I realized that in that moment, something large and dark had finally taken over her body. The creature no longer had any human features. Then I knew I was trapped, not just in this place, but in her body, in her subconscious, which had long since become alien. I felt like I needed to get out of here before it was too late. When I woke up the next morning, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but the fear that had settled in my body wouldn't let me leave Aubrey. She was there, and even though I tried to convince myself that everything would be okay, the anxiety inside wouldn't go away. There was still no life in her eyes, and it was driving me crazy. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just in another state of consciousness. She was in the thrall of something I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand how he could remain so calm, knowing that this girl I loved wasn't herself. His words were like a fog that was getting tighter and tighter around me. There was no answer to them, just emptiness. It was like he was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. That night, when I returned to our tent, I noticed that Aubrey was no longer sitting where I had left her. I felt a chill run down my skin. I quickly searched the room, but she was gone. It wasn't just disappearing. It was like moving into another space, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. I found it hard to breathe, and I felt the cold filling every cell of my body. I ran through the camp, screaming her name, but the forest was silent in response. Only the soft rustling of leaves, nothing more. I returned to the elder and demanded an explanation, but he again said that time will tell and that she will find her way. These words tormented me. I couldn't leave her here, in this place, among these people. I decided that if she didn't come back, I would leave myself, but I knew it wouldn't be an easy decision. I was surrounded by a mystery that didn't bode well. And then, at dawn the next day, When I approached the elder again, I noticed a strange glow in his eyes. It didn't look like a normal human expression. He looked at me as if I was something he needed to study. I realized that I couldn't trust anyone in this camp, and that these people weren't just seeking spiritual cleansing. They were part of something darker. The inability to find Aubrey and the hidden threat in the air made me feel more and more helpless. Suddenly, the elder said something that made me freeze. If she doesn't come back, you yourself will become part of this world. This place will change you. What did that mean? Why did his words sound so ominous? And what happened to Aubrey? I knew that if I didn't find the answers, I would be stuck in this place forever. And that wasn't just a metaphor. This camp, these people, this forest, it all felt like part of something far more terrifying than I could have imagined. And at some point, I realized that if I stayed, I might become what everyone else had already become. Part of the shadow that lurked in this place, a part of its eerie, foggy reality. I stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out into the dark expanse of the forest, feeling how every step forward pulled me deeper. The answers were somewhere nearby, but too far to reach. When I woke up the next day, everything was different. There was a strange smell in the air that I couldn't describe with words. It was sweet and musty at the same time, as if the forest was breathing something that had long since rotted, but was still there. I tried to break free from the embrace of sleep, but the heavy feeling in my chest wouldn't let go. Something was wrong. Everything that was happening was beginning to squeeze me like iron bars. I remembered Aubrey. She was gone. Or rather, she wasn't where I'd left her. No, that wasn't it. It was as if she'd vanished. It was as if her presence had vanished, and now I was alone in the midst of it all. I paced around the camp, hoping that someone who was here could explain what had happened. But everything was too quiet. People who would normally go about their business seemed to have vanished in an instant. I had no choice but to look for her myself. I headed towards the forest, along the same path that once led to the river where Aubrey and I often walked. It was a special place for us. There, in the shade of the trees, we could be ourselves, share what was on our minds, and forget everything that was happening around us, if only for a while. But today, the path felt alien. The branches that usually touched my skin gently now clung to my clothes like hands trying to stop me. The further I went into the forest, the stronger the feeling became that I was getting closer to the solution, but further away from the answer. The forest became denser and its sounds became unnaturally muffled, as if nature itself was hiding. Suddenly, I felt something cold touch my neck. I turned around abruptly, but there was no one in front of me. I took a step back and stumbled upon some strange metal structure hidden in the undergrowth. It was my body, and then my eye. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I felt the cold seeping into my bones. Everything around me became unbearably viscous, as if reality itself was trying to swallow me. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't obey, as if the ground was pulling me, holding me in place. I was stuck between worlds, unable to remember what had happened before I was here, and unsure of what lay ahead. The noise around me died down. Instead of the usual birds singing and rustling leaves, I heard only a hum in my ears that was getting louder, like an approaching storm. I realized that I couldn't stay in this place any longer. If I didn't move now, I might stay here forever. Part of this shadow, part of this nightmare. Gathering the last of my strength, I took a step forward, but I immediately felt as if the space around me was resisting, not wanting to let me go. I looked back again, and then I realized that I was not alone. The shadows that I had not been able to see before were now beginning to take shape. There were many of them, and they were all moving along their own trajectories, as if silently watching me. I walked forward, feeling these entities following me, but I didn't dare look back. My hand reached for the box I was still holding. In that moment, I realized that it wasn't just an object. It was a key. But to what? I was almost certain that if I opened it again, I would open a portal to a world that wasn't supposed to be accessible. But what choice did I have? If I didn't open it, I would stay here forever, in this place without time. I put the box back in my pocket and continued moving without turning around. Every movement I made left a feeling of heaviness in the air, as if I was breaking someone's silence, someone's sacred silence in this forest. The sky was low, like an impending threat, and it seemed like it was about to break apart and everything I knew would disappear. After a while, I found myself back on the familiar path. The forest had become less dense, and light was filtering through the trees, bursting out from behind them, as if something was trying to return to this world. But I still didn't feel relieved. I knew I was only halfway there, and no matter what I did, I couldn't leave here without knowing the whole truth. I quickened my pace. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of me. Not a person, but something resembling a silhouette, vague and indefinite. It looked like the same elder I had met the day before. He stood right in my path, his shadow covering everything around him. "You have come," he said, and his voice was like the whisper of an old tree that remembered everything that had ever happened in this forest. I knew I couldn't fool him. He knew what I had done. I couldn't answer. His presence was so strong that even the air around me was compressed. He knew. He knew I'd opened the box. He knew I'd seen that skull, and he knew I couldn't stop. "You don't understand," he continued. "You can't get out unless you finish what you started." There was more to his words than a threat. It was like a prediction, something that was inevitable, as if I were a pawn in a game that had begun before I was born. I took a step back, but his shadow moved with me, as if it had become a part of me. "What should I do?" I asked, even knowing that I would not receive an answer that could help me. He looked at me, and his eyes glowed with a dim fire, like two embers that had not yet gone out. "You have already made your choice. Now go." I knew that this was not advice, it was a sentence. And all that was left for me was to move forward, not knowing where or why. I kept walking. Each step was heavy, as if the ground itself was trying to stop me. The forest around me seemed alive, but not in the way I knew it. It was watchful. The trees weren't just standing there. They seemed to stretch toward me, their branches bending to block out the sky, cutting off the light. The ground beneath my feet became softer, as if I was about to sink into it, but each time I somehow pulled myself up, continuing to move. I felt the elder's shadow not leaving me. He was everywhere, even when he was not near, as if his presence had become a part of me. I did not know what to do, how to continue, but the only thing I knew for sure was that I had to move on. It was not just a necessity, it was something more. I was like a part of some larger plan in which there was no room for doubt. Suddenly I stopped. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, I heard a sound like moans. It was not a normal sound for the forest. I listened closely, and it sounded like crying, like a scream that was impossible to disagree with. It came from behind the trees, from somewhere far away, but its echo filled everything around. I wasn't sure what to do. Every instinct in me screamed to stop, to go the other way, but I was trapped. It was as if the sound was beckoning me, as if it knew I would definitely come looking for it. I took a few steps forward, and my feet sank into the earth. The soil felt sticky, like tar. "Don't go there," the elder's voice said. It was the same voice that had been in my mind, and its words were like the tip of a knife piercing the silence. But I couldn't stop anymore. Something inside me was pushing me forward. I pushed my way through the thick bushes and trees, closer and closer to that terrible sound. I didn't know what awaited me, but I felt like I had to find out. I found myself in the clearing. It was a place where there was nothing but a darkening light falling through narrow cracks in the upper layers of foliage. It was empty, but the shadows, the same ones I had felt as I moved through the forest, were now everywhere. And there, in the center of clearing, I saw him. He was a figure, but not human. He was a tangle of shadows, a misty mass that only resembled a human shape. He did not move, but it was as if his being was completely engulfed in this dark light that radiated around him. I felt his gaze. It penetrated me, tearing my consciousness apart. It was not just a gaze. It was a mixture of silent condemnation and bitterness that was hard to describe. And there was nothing alive in that gaze. It was alien, devoid of any warmth. He was what could have been evil, but an evil that knew neither hatred nor fear. And yet I knew I had to be there, despite everything. I couldn't just turn around and leave. I was connected to this place, to this creature, to this forest that wasn't just a forest. I was a part of it, and it was a part of me. I took a step forward. This time I felt no resistance. The shadows around me began to part, and I came closer. There was an emptiness inside me that became my only companion, but something in me still resisted. I knew that if I did not move away, I would not be able to return, but I could not stop. I had no choice. I came even closer, although a feeling of unease grew inside me, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing what would happen next. The shadows began to merge, forming one whole, as if some entity was beginning to form around me, crawling in the darkness, not giving me a break from its presence. As I stood at the very edge of clearing, I felt the ground begin to vibrate. It was almost imperceptible, but the vibration became more noticeable with every step I took. I was so close to the shadow that I could feel the air around me grow cold and heavy. Its touch on my skin was icy, but not in the same way as a frosty night. This was something else. It was penetrating me, permeating every cell. "You are not here of your own free will," came the same voice I had heard before. It was more pronounced, as if the entire shadow was speaking to me, and not just one person. But there was no aggression in this voice, only sadness. sadness, and hopelessness. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. My body felt paralyzed. I stood there, feeling everything around me darken and my thoughts shrink. This was not just a vision. This was a moment in which reality and illusion merged into one. I knew I had to do something, but I couldn't figure out what. You have become part of something you cannot understand, the voice continued. It seemed closer than ever. You came here, but you cannot leave until you have seen everything. And that's when I understood. I was not just a spectator. I was part of this place. I was trapped, and there seemed to be no way out. Everything I had done up until now had led me here. Everything I had seen had been foretold by this being. This moment had not been random. I had been chosen. I looked up and met this shadow. It did not move, took no form, but I felt that it was alive, that it was watching me. And despite its soullessness, I felt its gaze pressing on me. It was waiting for me to do something. I closed my eyes. A feeling began to grow in my head, as if I were sinking into emptiness, as if I were dissolving in this space. I tried to understand what I needed to do, how I could escape this nightmare, but the answer did not come. I knew that one day I would have to face what I had been avoiding all my life, what was hidden, what could not be hidden anymore. And now in this place, I would have to face it. I opened my eyes. The shadow was no longer just a shadow. It began to take shape. And that shape was familiar. It was me. Not me as I used to be, but a reflection of me, only distorted, intertwined with the fears and experiences I had tried to forget. Everything I had hidden from myself for so long now appeared before me in its most terrible form. I saw this distorted creature moving towards me, and it was not just a vision. It was what I myself was, what I had tried to hide, what I had to accept if I wanted to leave here. With every step he took, I felt my inner world crumble. He was a part of me, and I was a part of him. This was more than just a manifestation. It was a confrontation with myself, with what I never wanted to see. I didn't know how much time had passed, but when I came to, I was in the same place I had been before. But now everything was different. The shadows were gone, the air was lighter, and light was filtering through the trees. But there was still a heaviness in my head, a feeling that I hadn't come back from here the same as I had been before. I couldn't be who I was anymore. No matter what I did next, I knew I had another path to take, and it wouldn't be like all the others. Story 2. I'm not sure I ever really realized when I started doing this, but I noticed it had become part of my daily ritual. In recent months, I'd been checking thrift stores, Marketplace, Craigslist, and even eBay more and more. I didn't need specific things or feel like I was going on a treasure hunt. I felt like there was something magical in the air, like every item in those stores was a piece of history, a lost part of someone's life. Old things, forgotten, worn leather, and weathered, seemed to hold little stories that I could never touch, but I could feel their weight all the same. I even started looking for ways to resell these treasures. This whole idea became a kind of game for me. I became not just a buyer, but a connoisseur, an expert. Sometimes I found something really valuable, old things that I could resell for decent money. I learned to see value where others saw only old stuff. But there was another thing that fascinated me. How among all this junk you sometimes stumble upon real treasures, those very rare and unique items that everyone but me had forgotten. Yes, I had neither the ambition of a collector nor the desire to become rich. It was just my own little game. This game brought me pleasure. With each passing month, I became more and more fascinated. I got used to the rhythm of these shops, as I got used to every smell. All consignment shops have the same smell, slightly musty, with a hint of dust, of old things that haven't been used for a long time. Sometimes this smell became almost cozy, like the smell of an ancient library, where the books haven't been opened for centuries, but still hold knowledge. I began to notice details. In some places it was lighter, in others it was dark, but everywhere it was the same. Old things, forgotten, abandoned. One Saturday, when I knew I would have some free time, I took my son downtown. There was a pop-up store opening there, and I had seen some tempting offers advertised on Facebook. Of course, I had been putting it off for a long time, because work and other things always came first. But the day I finally decided to visit the store, I realized I wouldn't go anywhere without my son. I had a strange feeling that this place was just another little missing piece of my puzzle, a little treasure hunt. We arrived, and as I expected, most of the worthwhile items had already been taken. A strange feeling of uncertainty came over me. Why hadn't I arrived earlier? Why was I always late? Maybe all the most interesting things had already been snapped up by someone else? But that's not to say about everything. This time there was even something gloomy in the atmosphere. The store, which was opening for a week, seemed to have been set up hastily without much enthusiasm. In most cases, if this were a real store, its owner would certainly have kept things in order, would have placed the goods in more attractive corners. But here, everything looked different. There was a lot of junk, old paintings by unknown artists, pieces of glassware, broken toys, and piles of clothes that had clearly once been someone else's favorite thing. It was surprisingly beautiful in its own way in its disorder. My son headed straight for the clothes racks. It was his favorite pastime, and he seemed to forget everything else as he entered the maze of old pants and sweaters. I followed him, hoping to find something of interest. But as time went on, I began to feel like I had been there before. Cheap stuff, hidden in the dark. I knew I could find something worthwhile, but this was no longer the kind of store that would attract my attention. I passed a counter where a teenager was sitting with headphones on, ignoring everything around him. Sure, I could have criticized him, but I really didn't care. At his age, I wouldn't have been very interested either, standing in an empty store on a weekend. A box of vinyl records caught my eye. I stopped, intending to examine the contents. A terrible disappointment filled me when I saw that everything of value had already been taken. Vinyl record collectors are strange people. I have observed them more than once. Groups of middle-aged men standing outside a store, as if their lives depended on whether they would manage to acquire this or that lot. These people seemed to be constantly vigilant, but there was no joy or desire in their faces. It was as if they had to be there, simply because they always were. Frankly disappointed, I turned away from the records and headed for the children's section. It was always the same scene. Shelves lined with broken toys, board games with pieces falling off, and books no one wanted. And that's when I spotted my son. He was sitting on the floor, legs tucked under him, studying something. As I approached, he picked up a book. It was a book I couldn't place on the list of famous authors. He looked sheepish when he saw me, quickly slamming the book shut. But as soon as I got there, he hugged the book tightly and, with curiosity in his eyes, asked me to buy it for him. Doubts? No. I felt some inner uneasiness, but decided that it was just a coincidence. And so we left the store, and this book was now at home, among the other toys and books that make up my son's life. When we got home, I immediately felt a strange atmosphere, as if something had changed. I knew it was just my habit of making up reasons to worry, but something about this book bothered me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I had a nagging feeling that this book hadn't just happened to be in our house. It was somehow different from all the others. My son barely put the book down that day. He dragged it around with him, like it was something important that needed to be held close. I watched his face twist into a strange smile as he sat down on the couch and began to flip through the pages. He looked absorbed, like this world he was immersed in was the only thing that mattered. I was used to kids getting stuck on things, getting caught up in something temporary, but this time it was different. When I went I decided it was time to talk to him, but should I? I didn't know. I wasn't sure. My son had never been like this. He was quiet and attentive, but not like this. The next morning, when I went into his room, he was still holding the book. I tried to ask him questions, but he just smiled back and answered vaguely. It felt unnatural, like he wasn't fully there. I felt like there was something hidden moving between us, in that book and in his behavior. At dinner, as usual, we sat at the table, but he was there again, with that book. He was so absorbed in it that he was completely oblivious to everything going on around him. I tried to catch his eye, but it was as if he were not in this world. I asked him what it was that had captured him so much, but he simply said, "It's something I was reading." His answer made no sense. He didn't explain. He didn't share. As if this hidden something was his and not mine. As we finished dinner, I felt a strange sense of unease growing. He went back to his room as soon as I said it was time for bed. Usually he would have wanted to spend some time with me or something, but that day was different. He just disappeared into his room without looking back. This was not a normal evening. This was something else. Later that night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was quiet, barely audible, but I was sure I heard it. Voices, many voices, as if something was happening just behind the wall. I tried to figure out what it was. It was so strange. At first, I thought it was my son talking, but something was wrong. It wasn't a normal conversation, but rather like they were talking. There were voices, and his laughter was part of it. He was laughing to himself, and the silence that followed was even more depressing. I jumped out of bed and headed for his room. This was the moment I had to figure it out. I pushed the door. The room was dark, and I saw him right away. He was lying in bed, fast asleep as usual. The book was nearby, closed, lying on the table. I calmed down, but was left with a feeling of anxiety that did not go away. I knew something was wrong, but what? The next few days were filled with tense silence. Everything seemed to be going on as usual. My son went to school, I went about my work, but at some point I noticed that there was something strange in our house, in his room. Every night I woke up feeling this heavy, almost physical presence. And although I couldn't explain exactly what it was, I felt like we were on the brink of something we couldn't understand. He continued reading the book. His whole world now revolved around those pages. I began to notice his behavior changing. He was more withdrawn, less talkative, but he didn't seem worried. At one point, I even thought that perhaps this was just a phase of growing up, some kind of psycho-emotional experience of a teenager who had been captured by some literary world. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It had been several days since that strange incident when I woke up in the middle of the night and heard those voices. I couldn't forget that moment when the walls of my son's room seemed to come alive, filled with laughter, whispers, and conversations that weren't his. Something about that laughter made me afraid, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, just a figment of my nerves. But every night, when silence fell, I would hear those same sounds again. They would come and go, as if reflecting something that lurked in the dark corners of my mind. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was at my wit's end trying to figure out what was going on in our house. All my attempts to talk to my son about it ended with him simply not answering, or his answers were such that they didn't make sense. For example, he would say that they were waiting for him, or that they were just reading a book with him. I tried to figure out who they were, but he always just went to his room without explaining anything. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard those strange sounds again. At first I thought it was just the rustling of the wind, but it soon became clear that this was not the case. I got up and headed towards my son's room, not knowing what to do, but already feeling that it was time to find out something. I stood by the door listening. Everything was quiet. There were no voices. It was something worse. The silence that was oppressive. I opened the door. He was sitting in his old armchair, dimly lit by the table lamp, a book in his hands. He was in a kind of half-sleep state, as if absorbed in something I did not know about. There was neither joy nor horror in his eyes, only emptiness. I went up to him and gently put my hand on his shoulder. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying not to show my confusion. He didn't answer. He just stared at the book. It was like slow motion, as if his gaze wasn't registering reality. I didn't know what exactly was in those pages, but it seemed like something much more serious than a child's fantasy. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked at me. His eyes were empty, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, almost a whisper. "They're waiting for me. They're still there." They were strange words that made no sense, but at the same time they sounded like they were part of some deep-seated horror. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know how to deal with this feeling that my son had become a stranger, that he was no longer the same person he used to be. His words wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't shake the thought that they weren't just imaginary friends. This wasn't just a book. This was something much more dangerous, unimaginable, and dark. I stood in the doorway and all I could do was watch him go back to his book, go back to whatever it was that was keeping him in this state. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I knew I had to find answers. There was some kind of power in that book, and I could feel it growing stronger. I closed the door and went back to my room, not knowing what to do. I spent the next day searching. I searched the internet, trying to figure out what that book was. But there was nothing out there that would explain what was happening. I couldn't find anything that connected it to anything mystical or supernatural, but it was nagging at me. I felt like if I didn't find answers, if I didn't figure out what was happening, this could get out of control. I didn't know how, but I was sure I had to find a way to stop it. But what if the answer wasn't in the book? What if they weren't just something external? What if they were already here, among us, and used it to get closer? That night, I couldn't sleep. It felt like something inside me had snapped, as if something previously unknown and hidden had become a part of this house. I lay in the darkness, listening to my heart beat faster than usual outside the walls. And yet, I couldn't understand what was happening. It was as if something was hanging in the air, something invisible, elusive, building like a thunderstorm before a storm. Everything was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was not normal. Every rustle, every creak of the old floorboards in the next room made me flinch. I tried to calm myself, but instead I was increasingly tormented by the thought that what was happening to my son was not just a whim or a prank. It was something more sinister. I stood up, crept down the hall, and peered into his room. Everything was fine. My son was asleep, the book was on his bed, closed, just as I had left it. But there was something I noticed, a strange glow coming from the walls. A dim light, not from the lamp, but from the wall itself, as if something hidden was piercing it from within. I paused, swallowed, and moved closer. My breathing became ragged, and my heart began to beat faster again. I reached out and touched the wall. Almost immediately, I felt cold, icy cold, as if the wall itself was frozen. I flinched, but instead of moving away, I stayed, waiting for something I couldn't describe in words. Suddenly, as if on cue, something touched me. I turned around, but there was no one in the room. My body tensed, and I quickly walked to the door, trying not to make a sound. I was almost certain that someone was watching me, but when I looked at my son again, he was still lying in his bed, lost in sleep. I couldn't understand what was happening. What was it? Why did I feel so threatened when I just touched the wall? It couldn't just be my nerves. At night, when everything around me was silent, I would start to feel something supernatural, as if something was watching us. I tried to calm down and thought that all this was the result of fatigue, but something told me that it was not so. I went back to my room, not knowing what to do. I had no answers, but I knew one thing. I had to find out more about what was happening to my son and how this book was connected. The further I went, the more I felt that this book was not just an object. It was some kind of door opening, something that should not have entered our world. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to find a way to understand what was going on. I went back to the book I'd bought at the thrift store. It had none of the usual markings, nothing that would give the slightest clue as to what was going on. No author, no publisher, not even a year of publication, just a blank cover and a strange feeling it gave me. I opened it to one of the random pages. At first glance, it was an ordinary children's book with simple illustrations and text. But the further I read, the more I felt a strange atmosphere. Each word seemed to be filled with a heavy meaning, as if these letters were not simple signs but parts of something greater, something that was supposed to be hidden. I continued reading, but soon discovered that the text had no beginning and no end. It just went on, and the plot became more and more confusing. Page after page, I was immersed in a story that had no logic, but had depth, a strange, sinister depth. After a few minutes, I began to feel very uneasy. I felt the room getting cold, so cold that I knew that I was being visited again by that strange chill I had felt in the walls. It wasn't just a feeling. It was as if a shadow was covering me, swallowing me up. I closed my eyes and tried to get rid of the feeling, but it wouldn't leave me. I jumped up from my seat and ran to my son's room. He was in his bed, but something had changed. He was lying motionless. His eyes were closed, but there was a strange smile on his lips, one I had never seen before. I stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. He was so alien. It seemed like the book was still in his hands, but it looked different now. I couldn't tell exactly what had changed about it, but I knew that the book was now a part of him, and it was pulling him into some dark, unknown abyss. I felt the fear again. This wasn't just my imagination. This was real. I couldn't let him continue reading. This was dangerous. But how could I take the book away without knowing what it could do? With each passing minute, the fear in my heart grew. Something inside me told me that if I didn't take action, if I didn't stop him, everything would get out of control. My son had changed, and it was more than just his behavior. It was his essence, his relationship to reality. As I watched him, it became increasingly difficult to understand where normal ended and something different began. I stood in the doorway, looking at his motionless figure, still smiling that strange smile that wasn't his. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to act rationally. But what could I do? As if in response to my thoughts, his eyes opened. They were empty, like two black mirrors in which I saw nothing but a dark abyss. In that moment, I knew that if I didn't stop this, we might lose him. I stepped into the room, unsure of what would happen next. "Son," I said, trying to bring him back to reality. But instead of responding, he just continued to look at me with that same unnatural smile that now seemed to be part of his face. I shook his shoulder, hoping it would help, but he remained motionless. This was not an ordinary dream. This was something else. I could feel my fingers starting to get cold, as if I was touching something that should not exist. I carefully took the book away from his hands and immediately felt how the room seemed to become darker and the air became viscous and heavy. Something was wrong. I was sure that this book somehow affected his state, his perception of the world. I opened it again, looking for something that could give me an explanation for what was happening. The pages seemed empty now. No, they were not empty. They just did not have the text I had seen before. Instead of words, there were strange symbols, swirling lines, like an ancient font that did not exist in reality. I could barely make out these signs, but the feeling that this was something significant did not leave me. When I raised my head, he spoke again, but this time his voice was low, slightly inaudible, as if it did not belong to him. It was not my son's voice. It was an alien, dead intonation, some kind of from another world. He whispered a few words that I could not understand, and then fell silent, returning to his silence again. I did not know what to do. I felt how this house was filled with some unknown force, as if its walls began to breathe, and these breaths were filled with evil. This place where we lived became completely different, and this moment when I stood next to my son, holding a book in my hands, was when I realized that I could not stop this on my own. I had to find help. But where to look? What if it wasn't just illness or magic? What if what I held in my hands was actually something far more sinister? Maybe it wasn't a book at all. Maybe it was something that had entered our world through some mystical means, hidden from most people. I left my son in the room, trying not to look in his direction. His eyes were still blank, and I knew that at this point his mind was far from us. I took the book and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know what to do next, but I felt that if I continued to act as I had before, I would only deepen the problem. I looked at the book again. The more I looked at it, the more it began to resemble not an object, but an enemy that I had to face. It was a dark force that was creeping into my son's mind. In that moment, I realized, I can't be alone in this. I have to find answers, understand what this force is, and how to fight it. My first thought was to see a professional. Not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but someone who could help with something that was beyond human understanding. I thought of an old friend who had studied the occult and mystical phenomena many years ago. He was long gone from my life, but I knew he was more than just a theorist. He had met people who knew how to deal with situations like this. I called him, hoping he could help. He answered a few minutes later, and there was something in his voice that made my heart beat faster. It wasn't a normal hello. It was a voice filled with concern, almost as if he already knew what I was going to tell him. "Have you found something?" he asked. I just nodded in response, although he didn't see it. I took a book from the shelf and handed it to him, as if giving away part of what was beginning to consume us. He came to see me the next day. As soon as I opened the door, I felt his presence fill the room, as if he were not just a man, but something more. He was dressed in dark clothes, his gaze was cold, his face was tense. His eyes did not sparkle as they used to when we studied together, did not sparkle with interest, but were absorbed in something much more serious. I knew that he, too, felt something elusive, that had changed in this house since we brought the book. "Could you just mail it to me?" he said, barely looking at me, but I could see that his voice betrayed his concern. "Don't you understand what you've done?" I tried to explain, but he cut me off immediately. "You brought something into the house that is far more dangerous than you can imagine. You don't know what you're dealing with." He looked at me and I felt his gaze piercing me, as if he could see my soul. I didn't know what to expect, but my gut feeling told me that we were on the threshold of something much bigger than just a strange book. We sat down on the couch and I handed him the book. He took it carefully, not touching it too hard as if he was afraid to touch it, and then opened it to the first few pages. I watched his face become serious, even scared. "This is ancient," he said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "But it's not all. This is not just magic. This is not just ancient rituals or spells. This is something much more dangerous. You hold a door to another world in your hands, and it is open, and your son—" He paused for a moment and looked at me carefully. I felt the weight of his words begin to settle on my shoulders, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know more. "What do you mean? Are you saying that the book is somehow controlling him?" He nodded. "Not really. It doesn't control him, but it does affect his perception of reality. Every word, every symbol in that book is a conduit through which entities from another world can enter. And your son, he's become vulnerable. He started interacting with that world. You don't realize how quickly things can get out of control if you don't stop it now." I felt a chill run down my spine. He was right. Everything that was happening to my son was becoming stranger and stranger. This was not just a childish fantasy. He was talking to someone, his behavior was changing, and this book, it was connected to it. I could not remain in the dark any longer. "What should I do?" I asked, but I knew that the answer would not be easy. He thought for a moment, touching the spine of the book with his fingers. His eyes sparkled, as if he were unraveling some mystery. "You must take the book and destroy it immediately. If you leave it, you will destroy not only your family, but everything connected to this world. These books, they are not just magical, they are channels. They can summon dark forces that will begin to conquer everything around them. What you saw is only the beginning." My heart sank. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to destroy what had become part of our home, part of us. But I knew that if I didn't, all the horrors I'd endured would become unimaginable. I turned around and looked at my son, who I noticed standing in the doorway. He looked the same as always, but something in his eyes truly scared me. He didn't say a word. He just stared. I tried to call out to him, but he didn't move. He just stood there silent, and his eyes weren't the same as before. This wasn't my son. I jumped up as if on a whim and grabbed the book. My friend tried to hold me back. You don't understand. You can't destroy it that easily. If you do, you'll open a portal for all of these entities to come in. You've just destroyed not only this world, but them too. You. But I wasn't listening anymore. All I could think about at that moment was how to quickly get it back from the house, how to protect my family. I ran out of the room, and despite warnings, he didn't follow me. I stood in the hallway holding the book in my hands and realized that this would be our last chance. My heart was beating faster. With every step toward the garage, with every turn of the key, I felt the world around me grow darker. I stood by the garage door, clutching the book in my hands as if it were a heavy burden. Every minute, every second, until I was rid of it, felt like an eternity. It was dark outside, but not dark enough to hide from me all the strange things that were happening in the house. All I could hear were shadows, voices that echoed in my mind like whispers that had haunted me since the moment I opened the book. As I pulled the key from my pocket and inserted it into the lock, thoughts began to race through my head. I realized that this step would not be easy. If I decided to destroy the book, I would destroy not only an object that seemed like just a part of an old collection, but also perhaps the entire reality that surrounded us. Would the consequences be as my friend said? Would I be able to cope with what would be revealed after this? As I pulled the book out of my bag, slowly turning the pages, it became clear to me that its power was something more ancient and powerful than I could have imagined. Some of the words written on the pages disappeared as soon as I tried to read them. I tried to hold it in my hands, not letting it fall apart, but it seemed to be trying to break free, to free itself from me. I felt a chill run through my arms and goosebumps ran up my spine. The moment I unfolded the book and set it on fire, the light around me darkened. I felt a dark energy escaping, as if it was part of something huge, something I could not understand. I quickly brought the fire to the pages, but they did not burn. They only blackened, as if they were scorching the air around them. Then I heard it, a scream, a grinding sound, something otherworldly and inhuman. I wanted to break free from it, but I was paralyzed, not from fear, but from the fact that everything around me had become elusively strange. The garage began to change, as if the walls began to move, and the space was shrinking. I didn't have time to destroy the book. I didn't have time. Then I felt someone touch my shoulder. It was not my son. I turned around and saw something from the shadows standing right behind me. Its face was blurry, distorted, with eyes full of longing and pain. In its hands was that very book. You can't get rid of it, the voice said, and I couldn't understand if it was real or just an echo of my thoughts. I screamed, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt myself being pulled into something more terrifying than I could have imagined. Dark shapes bursting from the walls surrounded me, and I realized that the world I knew was crumbling. My consciousness began to mutate, to blur, and I found myself somewhere else, in the void. Everything around me was dark, but I could feel them, felt the presence of other entities, ones that were not part of our world. Then I remembered my son. Everything I had done, I did for him, but now I realized that this whole fight was not just a fight with a book. It was a fight with something much older, something that had been waiting a long time to enter our world. I tried to go back, tried to understand what to do, but it was too late. I could only hear the sounds of his laughter, the one coming from my son's room, getting louder, as if he was no longer just a child. It was something darker, something that no longer belonged to our world. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't take it back. Story 3. When I first met her, I didn't think she would stay in my life for so long. I didn't believe in long-term relationships, much less understand how a close friendship could be maintained if there was something that could connect us. She was just an acquaintance for me then, a chance encounter. I had already gotten used to such people who appeared in my life for a short time, but left some trace, and we parted ways. But with her, it was somehow different. I was at our first. However, over time, we began to meet more often. These meetings were no longer just parties with noisy companies and alcohol. We began to spend evenings talking, getting to know each other better, laughing and supporting each other when needed. Our meetings began to fill with some new meaning, and I realized that something was changing. I became interested in how she perceives the world, what her views on life are. We started with the fact that we were essentially not attached to each other, and now everything seemed much deeper. Then I became curious about how we would feel if we took things to a more intimate level. We were both open to experimentation, and the idea of trying something more intimate didn't seem strange. We had always been honest with each other, and I thought it was probably a normal step. We agreed that this would just be another stage in our relationship and nothing serious would happen. We continued to consider ourselves friends who had just decided to try something more. As much as we tried to keep it casual, when we moved on to sex, it was different. It was horrible. We both knew we weren't looking for deep emotional connections, but we expected something to be comfortable and harmonious. We both came into this experience with expectations that weren't met. I couldn't understand why it wasn't what I expected. We had great conversations, we laughed, but when it came to the intimate side, everything fell apart. There was no chemistry, no harmony. Sexual intimacy was a disappointment for both of us. For a long time, we couldn't figure out what was going on. We tried again, thinking that maybe the atmosphere just wasn't right. Maybe we were too nervous. We tried again and again, but it didn't work. To be honest, I felt awkward, and I knew that this experience wasn't going to be what I was expecting. We started to see each other not as potential partners, but as people who just weren't right for each other in this area. In the end, we came to the decision that it was better to remain friends. We knew that our chemistry was in other ways. We still had a good time together. We enjoyed talking. But this intimate side of the relationship was a mistake, and we both realized it. Despite all the disappointments, we kept in touch. But now it was purely platonic. Maybe it was naive. Maybe we thought we could stay friends, but in fact it was a test for both of us. We tried to refrain from flirting, from any hints, so as not to create false hopes. At some point it became routine for both of us. And although people continued to think that we were something more, we were both sure that there was nothing between us. We became like brother and sister. And the relationship that began with the intention of being a casual affair turned into a very strong friendship. But I knew it wouldn't be that easy. We had become very close friends, and that was good. But I also knew we had to stop looking at each other as something more. We were both ready to move on with our lives, and I felt like our connection had become more than just friendship. It was a tough time for both of us, but it also taught me to appreciate those moments when I could connect with someone without pressure, without expectations. This friendship with her had become something important to me, but I knew there were new challenges on the horizon that I had to face. With each month that we spent together, our friendship grew stronger. We no longer tried to pretend that there was nothing between us. We practically became brother and sister, or so it seemed. We could sit together and talk about anything, from the silliest jokes to deep thoughts about life. Honestly, I was surprised that our initial idea, just a few carefree nights, turned into something so stable and meaningful to me. But when I started dating another girl seriously, everything changed. I remember how it all started. I met her at a party, and even though we met different people, that night I knew there was a spark between us. It wasn't an instant crush, but there was something in her eyes, her laugh, the way she talked. We started talking, and it was something special. It took almost a year before we started dating. A year of waiting, a year of doubt. I never thought I would wait for someone for so long. But finally, when we started dating, everything seemed to fall into place. It felt right, as if we had finally found each other among the endless stream of chance, encounters, and fleeting relationships. I was happy with her. I was sure that this was not just another crush, but something more. Meanwhile, my friendship with her, the girl with whom this strange story had once started, was not disappearing. But now with a new girl in my life, it became a little awkward. We, of course, continued to maintain friendly relations, but something had changed. There was no longer that simple, carefree communication that had been before. I was increasingly busy with my new girlfriend, and as much as I wanted to maintain a relationship with my friend, I realized that it was becoming difficult to manage all these connections at the same time. And at some point, I began to feel torn. I increasingly turned to my new girlfriend for support, sought her advice, told her about my feelings. And to be honest, it seemed to me that I was distancing myself from my old friends. They, in turn, also began to notice this, and this sometimes became the cause of slight misunderstandings and resentments. It took a few months before I started to notice that things were getting more intense with my girlfriend. She didn't tell me directly, but I felt like things weren't going well. She wasn't happy with my friendship with her. She was starting to show signs that she couldn't take it anymore. She told me that she was trying to cope, but it was all becoming too much for her. I didn't know what to do. Anxiety was starting to build inside me because I knew I had to choose. All these relationships, these friendships, this relationship with my girlfriend, they were all starting to intertwine, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to figure out what I really wanted. She started saying that she couldn't continue the relationship unless I made a choice. She wasn't asking me to break up with my friend, but she was asking me to finally choose what was more important. And it became clear to me that I was in a dilemma and that maybe there wouldn't be room for everything in my life anymore. My friends, my new relationships, my old friendships, all of it was asking me to make a decision. I was stuck. And it wasn't just an easy decision, like I had previously thought. It was much more complicated. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My gut feeling was that something important was falling apart, and I couldn't figure out what it was. With every new attempt to sort out my feelings, the situation became more and more confusing. I was one step away from losing everything, both my girlfriend and my friend. My relationship with the girl I was dating was complicated. It wasn't just fell in love and live happily ever after. There were moments when it was difficult for both of us, but we always tried to figure it out, always discussed the problems openly. But now, as I was getting more and more immersed in my feelings, I realized that with every step in our story, I was moving further and further away from my friend, with whom I was once so close. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt that I couldn't continue with this. I tried to talk to my friend, but something had changed in our communication. It was hard to get back to the way things were. We both started avoiding the topic of my affair with the girl, as well as our common hangouts that could be awkward. She would ask a weird question that would remind me that I was the friend I was sleeping with. I felt awkward and didn't know how to act without offending either her or the girl I was dating. Not to mention, I felt guilty that our friendship, which had meant so much to me, was now just an obligation, something that had been a part of my life. But with each passing day, it felt less and less like what it used to be. At first, it seemed to me that everything would be resolved by itself. After all, we are all adults. We are capable of finding compromises. But with each passing week, it became clearer that nothing was being resolved. My friends and girlfriend became more and more disappointed. I could feel their discontent in every look, in every word, which sounded like some kind of hidden accusation. It seemed like I was on the threshold of something important in my life, but I couldn't take a step. I didn't want to lose my friend, but I also didn't want to lose the girl I was building a relationship with. I felt like I was in a cage, and I couldn't get out, not knowing where to go. My girlfriend, despite her feelings, was patient. She tried to understand me and let me sort out my feelings. But there came a point when she said she couldn't hide her feelings anymore. It wasn't something I could just talk about without consequences anymore. I started to feel like I couldn't keep her around anymore unless I made a decision, decided what was more important to me. All this time, I was worried that my friendship with my friend had become invisible to people. It was a strange feeling to be so close to someone, but at the same time feel like your relationship with this person is closed to everyone else. I know it's not great, but the fact that we went through hardships and problems together felt like something that connected us much more strongly than any other relationship. But the more I thought about how things should be, the more I began to realize that there was no turning back. My feelings for the girl were getting stronger and stronger, and my friendship with my friend was gradually fading into the background. I realized that maybe it wasn't a bad relationship, but it had become dangerous. It was like a dead weight that was preventing me from moving forward. With each new encounter with my friend, I began to feel my feelings change. All this time when I was just hanging out with him, it was normal, but now it became something unnecessary. I knew that he could always be called a support, but now I felt like this relationship was not allowing me to move on, not allowing me to build something more than just nostalgic memories of the past. At some point, I began to realize that maybe I needed to let go of this part of my life. Maybe it was one of those situations where you shouldn't dwell on what's already happened, and you shouldn't worry about it leaving an emptiness behind. But there was an emptiness all the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was wrong, that I had to change things somehow, but I didn't know how. It all came down to one simple question. Could I save all these relationships, or did I have to choose one or the other? There was no easy answer, no universal solution. I only knew that something had to change, and that change was inevitable, but I didn't know how to take the first step. The days dragged on like weeks, each filled with something unbearably heavy. I had gotten used to the idea that I had to make a choice, but the more time passed, the harder it was to make a decision. Our group of friends was falling apart, and each time I felt myself being pulled deeper into the process. I was no longer sure that I wanted to save any of these relationships, and although there seemed to be no other way out, this choice weighed on me like a huge stone on my soul. I decided to meet my friend because I had to talk to him. More and more, I felt like I couldn't stay put. I had always valued his support and friendship, but now I felt like it was all becoming something alien. I was nervous because I didn't know how to approach the conversation. I didn't want to offend him, but at the same time, I knew that if I didn't say what I thought, it would only complicate things. It was a quiet evening, and we were sitting in the same cafe that always seemed special to us. There weren't many people there at this time of day, and this moment seemed like it would be my last. I was nervous, going through my thoughts, trying to figure out how to approach the conversation without ruining everything. He noticed that I was in a different mood than usual. Is something wrong? His voice sounded in my head like a normal question, but now it was heavy, like there was something more hidden inside. I looked at his face, and it reminded me of how easy everything used to be, how easy it was to just meet and talk without any unnecessary hassle. But now, with my relationship on the line, I couldn't help but notice how much had changed. I don't know how to say this, I sighed heavily and leaned over my coffee cup, trying not to look him in the eye. You know how much I value our friendship, and you know that I could always count on you, but I fell silent. The words wouldn't come. It seemed like the very process of this conversation was already destroying my ideas about what would happen next. He was listening to me intently again, but even he seemed to sense that something had changed. Are you saying that all this time wasn't important? His words hit me, and I felt my shoulders grow heavy. He wasn't angry, but his voice was full of confusion. You think I don't understand what's happening to us? And so, at that moment, I realized that talking directly about my feelings was simply impossible. We were both on the edge, but neither of us dared to take a step. We both knew that the communication between us had to change. This conversation had to end not just in an argument, but in something more. I was so absorbed in how it all unfolded that I didn't notice how my life began to blur between these two people, between two important connections that could no longer exist side by side. My silence stretched. I didn't know what to say. I knew he was right. Did any of this really matter if I couldn't even figure out how I felt? Are you saying that none of this matters? He repeated, and I finally looked up. I saw the confusion in his eyes, and I knew this wasn't just a conversation. This was the moment I had to admit that we weren't where we once were. It was painful, like ripping a Band-Aid off a wound that hadn't healed. I don't know what I want, I said quietly. I think I have to choose. I can't keep being this close to you and then building a relationship with someone else. It's not fair. It's not right. Silence hung between us. I felt the weight of the decision swallow me up. I had said it out loud, and now the words would not disappear. There was no going back. He didn't answer right away, but in his eyes I saw everything I needed to understand. This was not just a breakup. This was an admission that our lives had diverged and might never meet again on the same level they once did. When I left the cafe, I felt empty. The decision I had made was necessary, but it left me empty. I didn't know what to do next. Didn't know how to feel. I had taken a step, but what would come of it was unclear. I couldn't understand what it was like to lose a friendship that was so important to me, but I knew I had to move on. At the same time, thoughts about the girl I was in a relationship with were playing in my head. Things were getting even more complicated, and I didn't know how to tie all these disparate feelings together. Now I had another choice to make. After that meeting with my friend, I felt broken. The decision had been made, but the inner unrest did not leave me. I had lost something important, something that I never thought I would have to let go of. It seemed like the right step, but it did not make me feel any better. Every day was full of questions that I could not find answers to. I knew that I needed to change something, but what exactly? How to sort out all these feelings? And would it not make things worse for everyone? My girlfriend, with whom I was now in a relationship, of course felt that something was wrong. She noticed the changes in my behavior and began to ask what was going on. And this was the final push that led me to the idea that I had to figure myself out. I could no longer afford to remain in this intermediate state. I had to either come to some kind of decision or move on, with the possibility of losing everything. But I didn't know what to do. My life up until that point had been full of uncertainty, but now that I realized I had essentially created this chaos, I didn't know where to start. I tried to justify my actions, convincing myself that this was all part of growing up. But it seemed like this whole adult life was becoming more and more confusing to me. I couldn't continue a relationship with the girl I was in love with and maintain the same level of intimacy with my friend. The difficulty wasn't in choosing one of them, but in how to do it correctly without ruining everything that had come before. She, my girlfriend, was waiting for an answer, and I didn't know how to tell her that my feelings had started to change. I kept thinking about my friend, and it wasn't easy. He was the one who knew about all my problems and always gave me advice. We were like brother and sister, and at some point I started to think that maybe I would be happy without this complicated relationship that I was creating for myself. On the other hand, my girlfriend was the person I wanted to be with, the one I wanted to build a future with, but her feelings for me were also worrying. I knew that she was going through this much more deeply than I was, and I didn't want to hurt her even more. One evening, when I was sitting alone in my apartment, I realized that I had to take a step towards this situation. I couldn't allow myself to be this hesitant person who didn't have the courage to sort out her own feelings. I sent her a message, a simple text, but it contained all my worries. I wrote that we needed to talk, that I needed time to sort out my feelings. She responded almost immediately, as usual, and I felt the weight lift from my heart. Everything became a little easier. But I knew that now I had to finally understand what I really wanted. I was determined to talk to her face to face. At this point, I needed to be honest. I could no longer hide my confusion. When we met the next morning, I felt like I was having a hard time starting this conversation. We sat down over coffee, and it was clear that she, too, sensed that something important was happening, that something was wrong. I knew that if she stayed with me after all this, it meant that her love would be strong enough to handle whatever difficulties we would experience together. But at the same time, I couldn't help but realize that a relationship like ours had to be built in trust. And if I couldn't give her that, then maybe I needed to leave. It was hard. At one point, she placed her hand on mine, and I felt her warmth radiating to me. But it wasn't just warmth. It was a signal that she was ready to talk, not to judge, not to blame, but simply to listen. "I want you to be honest," she said, and her voice was soft, but there was strength in it. "I can see that you're worried, that you can't find peace. And I want you to know that I'm here for you. But I can't force you to be with someone if you're not ready. You have to figure it out for yourself." Her words were worth their weight in gold. I knew she wasn't going to blame me, but I still felt how hard it was for me to say it. I knew she needed me to be honest, and that being honest would be an important step in our relationship. I'm not sure of myself right now," I finally said, looking up at her. "I think I need some time to figure out what I want. I can't promise you it'll be easy, but I want you to know that I appreciate you and everything you've done for me." She nodded, and I felt her hand squeeze mine. It was a little comforting, but I knew the future was still uncertain. We had a lot to work through, and this was not only a test for me, but for both of us. After that conversation with the girl, my life felt like it had fallen apart into several separate fragments, and I didn't know how to put them back together. I felt like a person who was constantly at a crossroads, not knowing which way to turn. Friends, relationships, internal contradictions, everything seemed like an insoluble tangle. And most importantly, I realized that I couldn't simply ignore or forget about what I had been going through in recent months. This feeling of internal dissonance did not go away. I could not continue to live with this burden. Every day was like the next. I would come to work, meet with colleagues, but it would all happen through a curtain, through distance. I couldn't really concentrate. The girl and I talked a little, but her silence was painful. She didn't ask me directly what was happening to me, but I felt that everything I said was already becoming almost unimportant. Isn't that what always happens when you can't tell the truth? She had always been so understanding, so patient, but now there was a hint of alienation in her gaze that I couldn't ignore. There were times when I thought maybe I should just stop everything, disappear, walk away from all these thoughts and decisions, but I knew that would be running away, and it wouldn't solve the problem. All I was doing was postponing the inevitable, but I had to decide. My thoughts kept returning to my friend. I felt like I'd lost something important that I didn't even know how to appreciate. There was something about our friendship that went beyond the ordinary, but that awkward moment, the intimacy I'd been trying to maintain, now felt like a huge barrier. How could I continue to maintain such closeness when it threatened everything else in my life? I thought at some point I realized that I really couldn't continue to remain in this state of limbo. I had to do something to either put an end to it or fix it, but what to choose? The relationship with my friend was so complex and multi-layered that I couldn't just cross it out. On the other hand, I also couldn't help but wonder if it would be possible to be in a relationship with a girl if I couldn't give up my attachment to my friend. All this made me turn to the girl I was in a relationship with again. I had tried many times to find the words to explain what was happening, but each time something held me back. Being honest was so difficult. I knew she was waiting for some clear decision from me, but what if that decision was the wrong one? One evening, as we were sitting in a cafe again, I decided that I had to talk to her. I couldn't put it off. My indecision was only making things worse. With each passing day, I felt myself losing my confidence and control. She looked a little tired, but at the same time very attentive to everything I said. She waited. I have to tell you something," I began, feeling a heaviness in my chest. My fingers trembled, but I continued to speak. "I don't want you to think that I don't appreciate you. You mean a lot to me, and I think about you. But I'm not sure I can continue this relationship unless I deal with what's going on inside me. I feel like everything around me is starting to fall apart, and I can't ignore it." She was silent. I saw how her eyes were focused on my words. She was listening to me, but her silence was heavy. I continued. I don't want you to think that I don't love you. I don't. But I have issues that I need to deal with a friend, with myself, and I can't promise that everything will be easy. But I promise you that I will be honest with you. The silence that reigned between us was almost unbearable. I didn't know how she would react, but she just looked at me, and her eyes expressed more than words. You say you need time to figure things out, and I understand that, she said finally. I won't force you to make a decision right now, but please don't leave me in the dark. I'm willing to wait if you really want to be with me. Her words were gentle, but they couldn't blur the reality I found myself in. I knew I couldn't continue living in this uncertainty, and yet I found it difficult to make a choice. Everything around me became some kind of chaos, as if I was in a whirlpool that could suck me in if I didn't take my fate into my own hands. There was only one question spinning in my head: how to solve this problem. I couldn't find an answer. I couldn't understand which path would be right and which would lead to disappointment, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in this state of eternal waiting. As my girlfriend and I sat at the same table in the cafe, I kept thinking about how to approach this issue. My heart was beating faster, as in those moments when I had to make a difficult choice. What if I'm wrong? What if she stops understanding me if I choose the wrong path? I tried many times to find the strength in myself to simply say that I was ready to make a decision, but something always held me back. I knew that the feelings I had for my friend could no longer remain just friendship. This was not just an alliance based on common interests. We had become too close, and this closeness had crossed the boundaries of friendship. I could not ignore this, but I could not forget that there was a girl in my life who was waiting for clarity from me. How could I maintain this relationship if it did not have a clear foundation? How could I choose when both worlds seemed important and integral parts of me? There were moments when I tried to escape from it, to go to work or other things, but it did not work. I could not get either peace or clarity. All I did was keep postponing the decision, hoping that time would solve everything by itself. But time, as always, was not my ally. It only added doubts and increased the feeling of emptiness. And worst of all, I lost the ability to clearly see the boundaries between what was important and what might just be a temporary problem that could be solved over time. Then I realized that if I didn't deal with this now, my whole life would be in limbo. I would still be lost in this torment, feeling that something was wrong with both my friend and my girlfriend. I had a strange thought that maybe I wasn't ready for a serious relationship at all. Maybe this was still my misunderstanding that I had to resolve before it was too late. Maybe I still hadn't grown up and wasn't ready to take responsibility for other people besides myself. Eventually, I made the decision that I needed to sort myself out. It wasn't really a decision. It was a step back in order to take the right step forward. I told the girl that I needed time. I asked her to understand that I couldn't be with her if I couldn't figure out my own feelings. I couldn't promise to resolve this conflict right away, but I knew for sure that if I didn't take a break, didn't give myself a chance to focus, I would lose everything, both her and myself. Then I ran into a friend. Our relationship had become weird too. We were closer than ever, but I felt myself drifting away from him because it was becoming more awkward than before. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay and that everything would be like before. Our conversations became less and less frequent, and every time I tried to talk to him, I felt myself getting uncomfortable. I couldn't be honest with him because I was too confused about myself. I knew it would hurt, but I decided I had to admit it to myself and then tell him what was going on in my head. I couldn't continue to be in this triangle. It wasn't fair to him or the girl, and it was especially unfair to myself. When I now sit, story 4, I always, but I kept, but the worst part was that he had never told me about it. He had never mentioned that his affection for this man had gone beyond mere friendship. He had assured me that he was not interested in anyone but me. He had said that he did not want an open relationship, that I was the only one for him. But now I was faced with the fact that it had all been a lie. How could I have been so wrong? How could I have been so unaware that he had been playing me like a puppet in his own secret little game? I sat on his bed, in the room that had once felt like our sanctuary, and I knew I could never be the same again. Everything had changed in an instant. The trust that had been the foundation of this relationship was shattered. Suddenly, everything felt foreign. His scent on the pillow, his habits, his words, they all lost their meaning. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. But what surprised me was that I didn't hate him. I wasn't angry. I was just devastated. I was bitter and hurt, but the pain wasn't complete. It was the pain of confusion, misunderstanding, resentment, but not hatred. I couldn't be angry at him. I could only be angry at myself. At myself for believing a lie for so long, for not seeing what was happening right before my eyes. I thought I knew him. but now I wasn't sure of anything. When I put the phone down on his desk, I felt empty. It wasn't relief. It was like falling into a dark abyss where there was nothing but my own thoughts, which wouldn't leave me alone. I felt like this moment would haunt me for a long time. And now that I thought about how to approach the conversation, how to talk to him about it, I knew that it would never be the same. I already knew the answer to everything, and that answer ruined everything. The time after I learned the truth became unbearable for me. It was as if I had closed myself in my own world, and everything that had seemed important before now seemed empty and meaningless. The evenings we spent together no longer brought me joy. All those moments when we laughed, held hands, talked about the future, lost all meaning. Instead of enjoying this time, I began to feel strangeness in everything that surrounded us. Even his presence next to me caused me an internal chill. I began to avoid communication, hiding my feelings behind an external wall of indifference. Every word he said, every movement he made in the house seemed like a game to me. I began to doubt how much of it was real. Every time he came up to me, I felt myself moving away inside. It was hard for me to look him in the eye. I tried to find answers to questions, but all I heard was silence. A silence that I had chosen for myself, but could not control. After all, how can you talk about something so difficult and destructive when your head was already full of thoughts, and your heart could not accept reality? Every now and then in moments of loneliness, I would think that maybe I was exaggerating, that it was just a mistake or a misunderstanding. But when I thought back to his words, his actions, what was behind those messages, I knew that it couldn't be a mistake. It was the truth that he had carefully hidden from me. And every time I thought about how to approach the conversation, how to express my feelings, I would hit an internal barrier. I didn't know how to start, how to tell him that everything I felt didn't matter anymore, how to tell him that his lies had killed everything that was between us. I realized that I didn't have the strength for these conversations. I didn't know where to start, how to take this step. On the other hand, I was afraid of what would happen when I told him about it. I was afraid that everything could collapse completely, that there would no longer be the trust that existed between us. And this scared me no less than the lie itself. After all, something inside me whispered that if I didn't figure this out, I would suffer even more. I couldn't live in a state of uncertainty any longer, but I also didn't know how to cope with what I already knew. The knowledge was destroying me, and at the same time it was necessary. All this time I was trying to find support. I couldn't tell my friends. I couldn't open up to my family. It was too personal. I didn't want anyone else to know that my partner could betray me the way he did. I was ashamed that I had found myself in such a situation. I didn't want to show my weakness, my vulnerability, because that would mean admitting that I had failed, that I hadn't noticed, that I hadn't been attentive enough. But still, sometimes when I managed to distract myself a little, I thought it would be easier to talk to someone who understood. Meanwhile, he continued to act as if nothing had changed. He probably didn't even notice how far we had drifted apart. He was busy with his own things, and I was busy with my own thoughts. He smiled, asked how I was, but behind those questions, there was no sincerity that had previously permeated his voice. I couldn't believe his words anymore. He knew nothing about what I had seen, and every time he tried to be nice, I couldn't shake the feeling that his kindness was just a mask. It was all too superficial. I didn't know what would happen if I revealed my feelings to him, if I told him that I knew he was lying to me. Questions kept running through my mind. Why did he do it? How did he feel when he wrote to that person? Was it a moment of weakness, a mistake, or something more serious? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, what did I mean to him now? Maybe I was just convenient so he could maintain the illusion of a relationship without actually investing in it. Maybe his affection for me wasn't as deep as I thought, and that would be another searing truth I would have to face. I continued to live in this state where silence became my protection, and every glance at him was a reminder that I didn't know how this whole story would end. Every day, thoughts of talking became more and more obsessive. But each time I postponed this moment, I wasn't ready, and I probably wouldn't be ready for a long time. As the weeks passed, I sank deeper into my thoughts. Time didn't bring relief. In fact, it did the opposite. It squeezed out the last vestiges of confidence that things could be fixed. I tried to convince myself that maybe things weren't so bad, that I could forgive him and forget. But every time I looked at his face, I found it hard to believe. I felt like an impenetrable wall had grown between us, and I was alone on the other side, where only doubt and pain remained. The lies he told me were like a virus, destroying everything that was important in our relationship. They infiltrated every corner of my life, sucking the strength and confidence out of me. Every now and then I tried to force myself to think of the good, to remember the times when we were happy, but I couldn't separate them from what I now knew. It seemed impossible. All our endless conversations, Our plans for the future seemed empty now, false. The moment when I found out what had happened kept playing over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been built on a lie. He had done this, and he hadn't told me, hadn't shared, hadn't opened up. Everything I thought about him had fallen apart like a house of cards, and now all I could do was stare at his face, trying to find some remnant of the man I once knew. Every morning I woke up thinking that I still couldn't talk to him. Every night, when we were sitting at dinner or just silently watching TV, I kept replaying in my head the moments when he could confess, when he could somehow explain why everything turned out this way. But every time, he continued to act as if nothing had changed. He didn't even notice that his words no longer applied to me. He didn't know that I had already lost all trust. When he looked at me with a smile, I didn't see his true feelings, but only an attempt to hide what was really there. I didn't want to be part of this game. The thought kept popping into my head, if he can do this, what else is he hiding? It wasn't just a question of sex or what had happened between them. It was a question of his honesty, whether what he said and what he did could be trusted. His every move seemed suspicious now. I couldn't trust him, and I probably never would. That night, when I found the photos, videos, and messages, it was a turning point for me. It was then that I felt everything crumbling around me. I shouldn't have been looking, shouldn't have been in his personal space, but I was looking for the truth, and now I knew it was hidden. I knew he had lied to me more than once, that he hadn't been sincere, and that moment of realization was terrifying, but it was also liberating. I knew I couldn't turn a blind eye to what had happened. The lies that had remained hidden for so long were no longer part of his personal life. They had become part of mine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both trapped now. But what to do next? How to approach him to express all these feelings that were turning me upside down? I didn't know how to start this conversation. It was scary, because even though I knew I needed to open his eyes to what I knew, I wasn't prepared to hear the truth if it was even worse than I imagined. What if he just didn't see anything wrong with what was happening? What if it was just a crush for him that didn't matter? What if he didn't realize how much what he did hurt me? It was hard for me to even imagine what the moment would be like when I could tell him how I felt. I was afraid that the conversation would turn into accusations, that he would defend himself, make excuses, perhaps try to reject my words, because for him, perhaps, it was not something that meant so much. But for me, it was devastating. I didn't know if I could accept his words, if I could even continue the relationship after what I had learned. I needed time to collect my thoughts, but with each passing day, this conversation became more and more inevitable. I couldn't stay in this foggy zone of uncertainty. Everything inside me screamed that I had to talk to him, that I couldn't live ignoring the truth. But at the same time, I felt afraid. What if after this conversation we could never return to the state we were in before? What if I saw something in his eyes that made me give up everything I had ever felt? A few more days passed, and despite my best efforts to calm down, the storm in my head continued. I lived with this silence, which became even more oppressive than the conversations we had previously had. We did not talk about what had happened. He continued to act as if nothing had changed, but I felt his silence weighing on me, forcing me to weigh up what I should do every day. I was trapped in my frustration and resentment, but what was I to do with it? I hated the silence. It reminded me that I was forced to hide my feelings, and he was forced to pretend that nothing had happened. Every moment I sat next to him, I felt this unspoken truth lying between us, like a heavy stone that prevented me from breathing. He didn't ask me how I felt. He didn't ask questions. All he did was continue living his life, not noticing that for me, it had become a living hell. At night, I couldn't sleep because my thoughts kept returning to what I had learned. Those images, those photos, those videos, they were like a constant backdrop, a reminder that I was just part of something much more complicated than just a relationship. Everything we had built together now felt false, and I couldn't shake that feeling. I thought about how we could change the situation, how I could make him understand that I couldn't be with him if he kept hiding the truth. Sometimes I found myself thinking that it would be better if he had just told me everything when we first had doubts. Maybe it wouldn't have solved the problem, but at least there wouldn't have been this endless heaviness that had hung in the air these past days. This silence was what was destroying us. I felt like his silence wasn't just an absence of words. It was a refusal of any sincerity, an admission that he didn't care how I felt. I tried to suppress these thoughts, but they were too much. Consumed by the feeling of betrayal, I thought about how I would live my life, how I would look at him if this truth finally came out. I couldn't imagine how we would return to normal after what happened. It was like a broken glass vase that couldn't be glued back together. no matter how perfect it was. All the words he could say couldn't bring back that moment of trust that was broken. One evening, when he came home late, I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't just continue to remain silent, continue to go with the flow, hiding my feelings. I was ready to talk. I didn't know how he would act. I didn't know what he would say, but I couldn't wait any longer. I stood up from the couch, looked at his face, and in that moment I felt my heart beat faster. Everything inside me screamed that this would be the moment of truth, the moment that would change everything. But I couldn't turn back time. I couldn't avoid this conversation that was inevitable. I still didn't know what I would say first, but I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I couldn't allow myself to be the person who just sits and endures, not taking steps toward resolution. I saw him take off his jacket, his eyes meet mine. And in that moment, all I felt was not confidence, but fear. Fear of what I would do when he started making excuses, or worse, continued to hide the truth. Fear that after this conversation I would be alone, and that I would not be able to restore the trust that had been destroyed. I stepped forward and said it. I didn't know what would come of it, but I could no longer stand aside. Silence was worse than any answer, worse than any truth. When I started to speak, my words were like a weight that I had been carrying inside for so long. I didn't know where to start, didn't know how to properly convey everything I was feeling, but when the first sound came out of my mouth, everything inside me seemed to collapse. He stood in front of me, still calm, and perhaps didn't realize how important this moment was for me. I didn't know what would happen next, and I thought that if I didn't say everything that had accumulated now, I never would. The words he stood the side. It took him a while to finally say something. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if he wanted his words not to affect me. He said he didn't know I would react this way, that he didn't think it would affect our relationship. It was like a slap in the face. He didn't know it would hurt me so much. He didn't know that any of this mattered to me. It was as if everything I felt didn't matter, as if his actions didn't matter. He tried to justify it by saying that it was a long time ago, that it was over, that things were different now. But how could I believe that? How could I believe that he had simply forgotten about what happened when I had all this evidence of his lies in front of me? He kept saying that he didn't want me to suffer, but his words rang hollow. No words could restore the trust I had lost. Every attempt at justification, every look he gave me, was like a knife that dug deeper into the wound he had inflicted on me. He didn't say anything that would change how I felt. Everything he said seemed like an attempt to deflect blame, not an admission that he had done something wrong, that he had hurt me. I didn't know what to do with it. Every time he opened his mouth, his words only confirmed that he didn't understand why I was hurting so much. And that was the hardest part. I felt like I couldn't be with him anymore. Not because I didn't love him, but because I couldn't trust him anymore. His confessions weren't helping the situation. They were making it worse. I stood there, stunned by his words, but deep down I knew that nothing would ever be the same. I couldn't go back to the way things were before I knew the truth. All I could do was figure out what to do next. I wasn't sure I could forgive him. And even if I could, did he know how much it would take to rebuild trust? How long would it take me to forget everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned? It wasn't just a question of forgiveness. It was a question of whether I could live with what he'd done to me. And honestly, I wasn't sure I could. His silence, his attempts to justify himself, could not fix what had been destroyed. I did not know if it would ever be possible to return to the way things were, but I knew that until he understood the depth of what had happened, it would be difficult for me to be with him. I knew that there was a long way ahead of us, and I was not sure that I was ready to go. I did not know how long we were silent. Time stretched out, like an unbearable feeling of anxiety that did not leave me. When he finally spoke, his words were not filled with sincerity, but rather sounded like an attempt to talk out. But I could not stop. I needed to figure out what I was going to do next, because everything had changed, and if anything could go back to how it was only if I made a decision. He kept saying something about how he was worried, about how he didn't want to lose me, about how he was sorry. I didn't hear these words because they didn't matter. To me, they were empty sounds that couldn't replace what I had lost. I already knew that his words couldn't atone for his actions. But even if they were empty, I still wanted to hear something that could convince me. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I was weak. But I hoped for some trace of remorse, for at least a small spark that could make everything less desperate. As time went on, a new wave of emotions washed over me. I realized that the more he talked, the more it became clear that his confessions were merely an attempt to smooth over his guilt and not a sincere desire to win me back. I couldn't help but think that his actions were deliberate and calculated, albeit hidden behind a mask of innocence. All those messages, photos, and videos I had discovered were not accidents. This was not a casual infatuation. This was the realization that he had neglected my feelings, that his affection for me was not as strong as I thought. No matter how much I tried to break it down, I couldn't find a simple answer. I felt like I had to make a decision, but every decision felt wrong. Leaving him would not only destroy the relationship, but a part of myself. I had always been the one who tried to find solutions, who was willing to work on problems, but now I had to accept that it was impossible to rebuild trust if it wasn't there. And it didn't seem to be there. I tried to imagine what would happen if I stayed with him. Every look, every word would remind me of what he had done, and I would carry it with me like a constant burden. And even though I still loved him, it wasn't enough. I couldn't be with someone who had betrayed me. All I felt was uncertainty. What would happen if I stayed? How long could I hide my pain? And in the end, how would I feel with this weight, this shadow, constantly weighing on me? But what if I left? I was afraid of being alone. I was afraid of tearing apart what was left. We had been together for a long time, and leaving meant not only parting, but also losing a part of myself. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to find something better. What if I couldn't find anyone who would suit me the way he did? But even these thoughts didn't seem as important as what I felt inside. My self-esteem had been damaged, and I could no longer ignore this internal protest. Eventually I took a step back. I knew it was my choice to leave him. Not because I hated him, but because I couldn't live with it anymore. I couldn't be in a relationship where I had to deal with doubt and betrayal all the time. I had to let go. I left, and the first few days were strange. The world around me seemed to go silent. I had to get used to being alone, to the idea that I no longer had to constantly think about what he was doing, who he was talking to, and what he was writing about. And although it hurt, I felt liberated. I began to understand that this relationship could not last, that I was ready to open up to something new, something real. But first, I had to learn to live with myself. In the first days, I felt emptiness more than anything. It was like losing a part of myself. I had to learn to be alone, and it was difficult. But at the same time, I began to realize that all those years spent with him were not in vain. I had grown. I had learned to be more honest with myself. And although I did not want to admit it, I realized that I had become stronger. I had learned to let go. I can't say it took a long time before I felt at peace again, but it got easier each day. I started to see the world differently, to perceive myself in a new way. I had time to think about what I wanted in life and what steps I needed to take to feel joy again. I took my time with new relationships. I knew that before I opened up to someone, I needed to be sure that I was ready to trust again. Over time, I realized that this experience was not just painful, it was a lesson. And now when I look back on it, I don't feel angry, I don't feel resentment. I just understand that it was a stage in my life that I went through. And now that I've let it go, I can move forward. I don't regret my decision. I realize that only by letting go can I truly be happy and open myself to new possibilities. This is how a new path begins. And although there is still much that I have to experience and understand, I know that I am not alone. I know that I can rebuild my life. I can learn to love myself and trust myself, and then maybe open my heart to someone new. But to do this, I had to go through this pain and come out of it with a new understanding of life. And it was worth it. Story 5. I was standing at the exit of the building where the graduation ceremony had just ended. I was holding a bouquet of flowers, not just any bouquet, but a carefully selected arrangement from a famous florist, each petal of which I had chosen with him in mind. In my small purse was a gift, a laconic box from Hermes, decorated with a ribbon that I had tied 3 times until it lay perfectly. I was wearing a dress in which I wanted to feel beautiful next to him, light, bright, emphasizing the line of the shoulders and a thin waist with a barely noticeable shine, reflecting the light of the setting sun. I had arrived early, as planned. We had agreed last week I would not go inside for the ceremony. He had not been able to get me a ticket, and according to him, there was not much space, but I would meet him outside when it was all over. He knew I would come. He said he would be glad to see me. I imagined this moment many times. Him coming out in his gown, his cap, his diploma in his hands, smiling, noticing me in the crowd and coming up to me. I would give him flowers, we would take a photo, he would hug me, say he was glad I came. And everything I put into this day, into his joy, into us, all of this would finally make sense. Instead, I stood and waited. At first, just excited, then slightly tense, then anxious. People were coming out in groups, parents, friends, happy graduates, all with flowers, balloons, hugs, and laughter. I peered into their faces, looking for him. He didn't show up. The phone remained silent. I checked the screen over and over, but nothing changed. I called once, twice, 3 times. With each ring, the voice inside me grew louder. Where is he? Why is he silent? Almost an hour passed. I stood against the wall, trying not to attract attention, hiding my eyes behind sunglasses. But something viscous, offensive, almost burning began to squeeze inside me. The flowers felt heavy in my hand. The trail of perfume I'd applied that morning suddenly became irritatingly sweet, sticky. It seemed like everyone around me was noticing. Here's the girl who got dumped. And I was already starting to believe it. I called again and again. On the 10th try, I stopped believing that he would answer. I watched other girls hug their boyfriends, and I was standing here in a beautiful dress with a gift, with hope that no longer seemed alive. It was as if something broke inside. Suddenly tears came, hot, bitter, as if all the feelings I was trying to hold in broke out without asking permission. I turned to the wall and cried. There was no one around who knew me. I just stood there, abandoned, unwanted, humiliated. I don't know how much time passed. It seemed to me that I had been standing there for an eternity. People began to disperse. The square in front of the building emptied. Waiters were tearing down decorations and snacks, removing the remains of balloons, crumpled ceremony programs. I was still holding the gift and the bouquet, although my hand was going numb. All I wanted was for him to come, for him to see how hard I tried, to make him smile. Sometimes it seems that when you try hard for someone, when you put your soul into every gesture, every moment, then it should be noticed, appreciated, accepted. But today I realized it is not always like that. Sometimes your feelings just do not find a response. They are like a message sent into the void that no one is going to read. And there is nothing you can do about it except accept you were not chosen. You were forgotten. Or worse, deliberately ignored. When I finally went home, the lights were out and night had fallen. The dress I had so wanted to wear with him now seemed out of place. The sparkle in my eyes that I had hoped to capture in a photo with him had been replaced by puffy, red eyelids. I felt stupid, ridiculous, like I was in a movie where everything had turned out differently than the script had intended. Only this wasn't a movie. This was my reality, my evening, my pain. I didn't write to him right away. I didn't want to seem intrusive, but everything inside me was asking for an explanation. Why didn't you come? Why didn't you write? Why did you leave me alone? I made up excuses for him. Maybe something happened. Maybe he had problems with his parents. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he forgot. It's funny to think that you can forget a person who loves you, who is standing there with flowers, who wants to make you happy on your special day. I went to bed without taking off my dress. That's how I fell asleep, with a phone in my hand, with an empty gaze at the ceiling, with questions that I thought could still be answered. But my heart already knew. This evening had changed everything. Something inside me had broken, and I no longer believed that we were us, because at the moment when I needed his hand, his shoulder, his simple smile, he simply didn't come. The next morning, everything seemed impossible. I woke up with the same heaviness in my chest, as if there was a stone inside me that had not moved an inch. My head was buzzing, my eyes were burning from tears, and my body was burning from tension in an awkward position. I woke up in the dress I had fallen asleep in, with my phone clutched in my hand, and with a feeling of emptiness that seemed almost physical. I looked at the screen. Not a single notification, not a message, not a missed call, not a word. And this silence was louder than any scream. It hit my head, my heart, all the feelings that I carried inside. I thought maybe he would write in the morning. Explain. Say at least something. Admit that he hurt me. Say that he was sorry, that he didn't mean for it to turn out this way. But there was nothing. No explanation, no excuses, not even a hint that he remembered me standing there, alone with flowers and a gift in my hands, on a day that was supposed to be special for him. I got out of bed and almost mechanically began to take off my clothes. Slowly, as if I was afraid to tear off the last of my hope, I folded the dress, put the box with the gift back in the closet, as if I was returning something unrealized back into the shadows. The flowers, already a little wilted, I still couldn't throw away. They stood in a vase, and I couldn't take my eyes off them. Each petal was a reminder of how hard I tried, how I prepared, how I waited. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I wrote to him, not reproachfully, not hysterically, just quietly, calmly, almost childishly, how much it hurt, how hard it is to stand alone on the most important day for the one you love, how offensive it is to see that your efforts are simply nothing. I wrote this, not expecting him to answer right away. I just wanted him to understand, at least a little, at least a piece of what I felt. The answer came a few hours later. Short, cut off, almost formal. He called it a mistake, said that he didn't want to hurt me, that he was sorry, without specifics, without sympathy, without the slightest hint of remorse or an attempt to make amends. Just words that people usually hide behind so as not to delve into someone else's pain. I read that message 20 times, every phrase over and over again, trying to find something between the lines, a hint, a feeling, a tone. But there was nothing, just a wall, smooth, dull, cold. I answered. I tried to say that I didn't need perfect words. I just needed him to feel, to acknowledge that it was important, that I was important. He didn't answer. He read it and nothing. No understood, no sorry, no let's talk. It was like my voice had vanished into thin air. I called. Not right away. I hesitated for a long time because I was afraid that if he answered, it would confirm the worst. And if he didn't, it would hurt even more. But I pressed call anyway, and again, and again. On the fourth time, he picked up. He didn't yell. He didn't make excuses. His voice was as calm as his messages, only colder. He said he wasn't sure he wanted to continue, said he needed time, that maybe he didn't love me as much as I thought, that maybe this just wasn't it. I listened and didn't believe him. Word by word, he took me further and further away, from the moment I dreamed of sharing with him, from the plans I drew in my head, from myself, the one who believed that we were only at the beginning of something real. It seemed to me that he was not saying this to me, but to someone else, because the person who wrote to me in the evenings, who kissed me on the forehead, who laughed next to me and looked into my eyes, could not be this strange voice on the other end of the phone. When he hung up, I was left in a silence that was not broken even by my own breathing. I did not cry. Not at that moment. I just froze, as if time had stopped, as if my world, built brick by brick from hopes, care, and feelings, suddenly began to crumble. Not with a roar, but quietly, almost soundlessly. First one crack, then another. And I stood inside, not knowing whether to save or leave. I looked at the flowers again. They had wilted even more. I took them and finally threw them away, carefully, as if apologizing to them, to myself, to the version of me that still hoped. This day was not about him. It became the day when, for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was alone, not because I chose loneliness, but because another person simply did not choose me. The next few days passed in a blur. Everything that was happening seemed unreal, as if it was happening not to me, but to someone else, whose life I was simply observing from the outside. I ate by inertia, a little, without taste. I moved around the apartment in slow motion, not because I lacked time, but because every step seemed meaningless. Nothing really touched me. Even the music that usually helped me now sounded muffled, as if through a thick wall. It no longer penetrated inside. I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the shelves, washed clothes, put away books. I did all of this mechanically, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't sit still. The silence in the apartment became unbearable. I caught myself sitting on the floor, holding a cup in my hands and just staring into space. Sometimes it seemed to me that all of this was a dream, that he would show up any minute now, write, call, say that this was all a mistake, that he was confused, that he was sorry. But no, the phone was still silent. Sometimes I caught myself thinking the usual thoughts. What if he's writing a message now and just doesn't know how to start? Or maybe he feels guilty but doesn't know how to express it? I wound myself up. I looked for excuses. After all, it's easier to think that a person simply doesn't know how than to admit that he doesn't want to, that he doesn't consider it necessary. One day I finally looked at his stories. There were photos with friends, laughing, relaxed, handsome, as always. Life was clearly going on as usual for him. Not a single hint of regret, not a single trace that he was worried at all. It was a blow, sharp, in the gut. I turned off my phone and threw it under the pillow, as if the image itself could destroy me. I lay back down on the bed. The room was stuffy, but I couldn't bring myself to open the window. I felt like if I let any air in, it would reveal my state. It was like I was trying to hide from the world, not just physically, but energetically, to become invisible, to dissolve. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something terrible, something that made him distance himself. I replayed that very night in my head, the day of the ceremony, the moment I texted him. Maybe I was too clingy. Maybe he felt I was trying too hard. Maybe I showed too much, or maybe I was just inconvenient. Someone who loves too loudly, someone who expects too much, someone who doesn't know how to keep her distance. But then I remembered how he called me himself, how he made small, warm gestures, how he laughed next to me. I didn't make these moments up. They were there. And yet he left, calmly, without a fight, without an attempt to explain, without regret. And then it began to dawn on me. He didn't stay because he didn't want to. It's simple, terribly simple. And that was the most painful thing, the realization that I wasn't that important. Not so necessary that he would stay for me, explain, apologize for real, fight. I wanted to disappear. Not forever, no. Just disappear for a while. Stop being the person who feels too much. I thought about how easy it was for some people to be indifferent, how easy it seemed to be detached. But I got stuck in anticipation, in memory, in feelings that no one needed anymore. I started writing a diary, not because I wanted to analyze, but simply because I didn't know where to put my thoughts. I wrote everything, incoherently, without punctuation, without logic. I wrote about how I hated this feeling of uncertainty, that I wanted to scream, that I was ashamed of myself for crying on the street, for continuing to call, even after he had already said everything, for still waiting. I spent one evening on the balcony, just staring into the darkness. I listened to the traffic below, the barking of dogs drowning out the distant hum of the city. And in that moment, I realized, no one is holding me anymore. I am bound by nothing but my own pain. I am holding myself in a cage whose key I threw away when I decided that the man who left without an explanation could still return. That night, I had a dream. I was standing outside the building where the ceremony had taken place again. Everything was like that day. I was in the same dress, with the same flowers, but this time there was no one. No passers-by, no woman comforting me. Just me, the empty street, and the wind blowing the hem of my dress. I woke up feeling as if this dream had been true, and the rest was not. That night, for the first time, I did not cry. Time began to stretch. It lost its clear boundaries as if the clock had stopped working according to its usual pattern. Day turned to night, but nothing changed inside me. The same thoughts, the same feelings, the same lethargy. I no longer expected messages from him, but I still subconsciously checked my phone, not to find hope, but rather to confirm its absence. He really was gone, vanished, like a shadow that was never real. I didn't cry. It was as if the tears had run out. There was a strange feeling of emptiness when you're not sad, but you're not living either. You just exist in this space between what was and what will definitely not be. I tried not to think about him directly. Every thought about him now felt like a splinter under the skin, small, almost unnoticeable, but if you touch it, it hurt. One day I put on the same dress I wore when I stood outside the building on his graduation day. Not because I wanted to bring it back to my memory, but because I needed to somehow regain control. I looked at myself in the mirror and suddenly felt angry. At myself, at him, at the way I stood there, waiting, naive, stupid, kind. The one who genuinely wanted to please someone and ended up with a broken heart. I remembered that woman, the stranger who had approached me then. Her eyes were full of warmth. She didn't know me, but there was more support in her gesture than in all the words I had ever heard from him. It's strange how sometimes strangers can give you more than those to whom you opened your heart. Sometimes I caught myself remembering details I didn't want to remember. The way he held my hand, the way he wrinkled his nose when he laughed, the way he fell asleep on my lap. There was not only pain in these fragments, but also tenderness, and it irritated me. I wanted to be completely angry with him, to forget, to let go, not to suffer. But there was still a part of me that saw him as a person, not a monster, not indifferent, just a person who turned out to be weak, scared, incapable of honesty. I started keeping a diary systematically. I wrote in the evenings, sometimes just a couple of lines, sometimes whole pages. I tried not to edit myself. I allowed myself to be offended, disappointed, funny, vulnerable. These entries became my mirror. I looked at them and saw myself, not the one who waited with flowers, but the one who stands now, after. She was quieter, calmer, but something began to change inside her. Not revenge, not a desire to prove, but simply the intention to survive. I noticed that I became more attentive to small things, to the light falling on the window, to the rustle of leaves outside the balcony, to the smell of morning tea. It did not bring joy, but it reminded me that I still felt, that not everything inside had died. Sometimes this was enough to live through the day. A week passed, then another. He didn't write. I didn't write. I didn't call anymore. At some point, I even deleted him from my contacts, not in a fit of emotion, calmly, without pathos, like dusting a shelf, simply because you don't need it anymore. Sometimes it seemed to me that I heard his voice in the crowd, or saw his back in the store. My heart sank for a split second, but then reality reminded me it wasn't him. and I was alone with myself again. This loneliness no longer frightened me. It became habitual, almost homely. I learned to be not a victim in it, but an observer. Not saved, but recovering. I began to learn to breathe again. Gently, not deeply, just breathe. I didn't know how long this would last. I didn't know how long it would take for him to stop being part of my memories. But there was something real in the uncertainty. At least I knew where I was. At least I had some support, even if it was just me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I wanted it all back. My dreams became restless. Sometimes I would wake up to the feeling of someone calling my name, the voice muffled as if coming from underwater. At those moments, I would sit in the dark and listen to the silence, as if I could find something in it, but nothing happened. It was just me in the silence. Sometimes it was kind, sometimes it was frightening. It had been over a month, but the memories were in no hurry to die. They grew like weeds even through the walls I built inside. I could calmly cook myself dinner, and suddenly, the smell of the perfume I wore that day, or a phrase in a book that was too similar to his words. Sometimes one little thing was enough to make a lump come to my throat. I didn't cry. I just fell silent, as if everything inside froze for a moment. I thought the pain would go away linearly, that it would get less with each passing day, but in reality, it was just changing shape. At first, it was a sharp, cutting sensation, like a cold knife in my chest. Then the pain became tight, viscous, like I was walking through a swamp, each step taking an effort. Now it was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but constant, like background noise that you can't get rid of. I started replaying everything in circles again, remembering how I planned that day, how I chose the gift, how I rehearsed in my head the moment when he would graduate with a diploma and I would meet him with flowers. Everything was so naive, so kind. I didn't think then that this kindness would go unclaimed, that all of this would simply not be needed. I tried to figure out, at what point did it all go wrong? He knew I would wait. He knew it was important to me. But he didn't even write. He didn't warn me, as if I was someone in the background. As if everything I did didn't deserve even a simple, "I'm not coming." And perhaps that was the most offensive thing. Not the refusal itself, but the lack of recognition, as if I didn't exist. Sometimes I caught myself wishing he would feel sorry, to understand what he had lost, to stir something inside him, not out of guilt, but out of regret. Not so that he would come back, but simply so that he would feel the weight of what he had done. But I knew that this was unlikely to happen. Because in order to feel sorry, you need to be able to feel, and he perhaps simply didn't know how. There were days when it seemed to me that I had overcome everything, that everything was fine. I went outside in a good mood, listened to music, even smiled, but then for no reason, something inside would fall, and again I felt that I still hadn't let go, that somewhere deep there was still pain, and I was angry at myself for it. I wanted to be strong, resilient, not to be the one who was so easily broken. I stopped visiting his pages. There was an internal struggle in this. Curiosity fought with self-respect. I wanted to know how he was, what he was doing, whether he was thinking about me, but I didn't go there, because I understood that any photo of his, any signature, all this could bring me back. And I didn't want to go back. I wanted to get ahead, even if the road would be long. One evening, I came across an old letter he had once written to me. It was short, but it had warm words. I didn't cry or tear it up. I just folded it back up and put it away. I didn't want to throw it away, as if I was afraid to destroy the last thing that proved it was all real. Maybe short, maybe wrong, but still it was real. I started reading more. Not novels, not love stories, something dry, neutral, philosophy, essays. I like to understand complex ideas. It distracted me. It made my brain work. I felt like a person again, not a girl who had been hurt, but an adult woman who worries, analyzes, draws conclusions. It was important. It helped. I signed up for yoga, not because I wanted to find balance, but simply because I needed to put my body somewhere. I realized that my body was tired of being the bearer of pain. It asked for movement, warmth, care, and I began to listen, slowly, without strain, just doing something good for myself, without expectations, without trying to heal, just because I can. I still remembered him, not as a prince, not as a lost love, but as an episode, as a lesson, as a person who turned out to be not who I hoped. And that was okay. People are not obliged to live up to our dreams. We are not obliged to hold on to illusions. The main thing is to learn to let go without the desire for revenge, without pain. Just let go. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was already different. Not better, not worse. Just different, with a quiet sadness inside. with caution in my gaze, with more care for myself. I didn't know who I would become in a year, but I knew that this version of me was the one that got out, the one that held on to herself when no one else did. And maybe there was something valuable in that after all. At some point, the pain stopped being the center, not because it disappeared, but because I stopped feeding it with thoughts. It was there, like an old friend, but it no longer sat across from me at the table. Sometimes I noticed it, in the reflection of a shop window, in a song I accidentally heard on the street, in the scent of jasmine that he once said he loved. But I didn't linger on it. I just passed by. I learned not to cling. More than 2 months have passed since that day. I haven't written to him, haven't called him. He's disappeared too. Disappeared, as if he never existed. And I wondered, how easy is it to disappear from someone else's life? Could love, or whatever it was between us, be so fragile? Or was it just a dream that I confused with reality? I started being alone more. Not sad, not empty, just alone. I'd go to a cafe, sit by the window and watch life go by. People were walking, laughing, some were holding hands, some were arguing on the phone. Everything was real, alive, and there was something comforting about that. The world hadn't stopped, so I shouldn't either. I tried to be a new version of myself. Not better, just different. I changed the route home, bought products I used to ignore, listened to music I used to ignore. I tried to surprise myself, not for him, not out of spite, but because I wanted to remember who I was without him. Because at some point, everything in my life was connected to him, even my thoughts. I wanted to bring myself back to myself. Sometimes it was hard, not because I missed him. I missed the dream I had associated with him, the image I had built for myself, the version of myself that believed he valued me. I missed myself, naive and trusting. Now I was different, not tough, but wary, and I didn't know if that was good or bad. Just like that. My friends didn't understand why I wasn't mad at him, why I wasn't trying to throw him out or get him back. But I didn't want either. I was just tired. Not of him, but of the constant feeling that I needed to prove something to someone. I didn't want to take revenge. I wanted to close the door and leave quietly, without noise, without final scenes, just put an end to it, quietly. I woke up more and more often without pain. It was a strange feeling, as if someone you considered a part of yourself had suddenly disappeared. At first you rejoice, then you get scared. Is that really it? Has it really let go? But yes, it did let go, slowly, without fanfare, without an obvious goodbye. It was just that, at some point I realized that I could think about the future without a sense of loss. I started dreaming again. Not big dreams, just small ones. A weekend trip to another city, new books, an exhibition I've wanted to go to for a long time. And these dreams didn't include him anymore. I didn't imagine us holding hands. I didn't draw pictures of us together in my head. It was liberating to dream just for myself. I signed up for photography classes. I've always loved capturing moments. As a child, I could spend hours looking at old photos. Now I wanted to create my own. No pose, no ideal. Just honestly, as it is. And there was something important in that. It was like I was learning to see again. People, light, myself. I even took a few self-portraits. Not to post, not to show off, but to remember who I am now. After. I noticed that I started trusting myself again. Not completely, but more than before. I wasn't looking for confirmation. I wasn't waiting for someone on the outside to tell me I was worthy. I was starting to feel it from the inside. Slowly, unusually, but it grew. Like light through cracks, like breathing after a long dive underwater. I forgave him. Not for him, but for myself. Because holding a grudge means holding it inside. And I wanted to be free, not from him, but from who I became when I was with him. Too attentive, too trying, too patient. I didn't want to be like that anymore. I wanted to be myself, even if that meant being lonely sometimes. I don't know how it will all end. Maybe I'm not at the final chapter yet. Maybe there will be new flashes of pain ahead. But right now, at this moment, I know one thing. I am alive, strong, honest, and I choose myself. Not because he didn't choose, but because I am worthy of being chosen. First by myself. 3 months have passed. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime has passed. I still remember that day, as if it were stuck in my internal calendar. Not because I want to remember, but because it became a starting point. It was the beginning of me, a different me, not better and not worse, just more honest. The present does not lie, even if it hurts. Sometimes I imagine what I would say to him if I could. Not in a fit of resentment, but simply, If I were given one chance to say everything without the fear of being misunderstood, I often think of it as a letter, maybe because there is something incomplete inside me that is asking to come out. Sometimes the words need to be pulled out of you, even if no one will read them. Dear you who once were everything to me, I don't know how you live. Probably everything is fine. Maybe you have another girlfriend now, other conversations, another spring. I don't follow you, not because I'm indifferent, but because at some point I realized that it's impossible to keep up with you. You were always somewhere a little further than I could reach. I tried for a long time to understand what my fault was. Where did I miss? What did I do wrong? Why did the day that should have been bright turn out to be the loneliest? Why did I stand with flowers that no one took? Why didn't you call, although you knew that I was waiting? Why did everything I put into you turn out to be invisible? I remember the woman who came up to me then. I don't know her name, but I still remember her hug. At that moment, I realized that you can be a stranger, but not be indifferent. And you can be loved and pass by. Your silence was louder than any refusal. You didn't just not come, you chose not to explain, and then not to return. I didn't write to you because I wanted to blame you. I wrote because I needed to understand. Do I matter? Did you feel anything at all? But instead of words, I got silence, the one with only my own echo. I would have understood the truth if you had said it, even if it was painful. But you said nothing, and then you just disappeared. Now I'm not angry, honestly. There is no rage in me anymore, only silence. The same one that first deafened and now calms. I finally understood that a person who knows how to love will not leave another alone on their special day, will not let them cry on the street, will not disappear in response to vulnerability. And if he disappeared, then it means he was never really there. You know what's most offensive? That I really tried, not for the sake of praise, but because you were valuable to me. I sincerely wanted to please you. I chose a gift, thought about the little things, imagined how happy you would be. But instead, I saw how easy it is to become unnecessary, how care turns into emptiness if the other does not accept it. Now I am not looking for answers. I let go, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free, to be with someone who sees, who hears, who does not run away at the most important moment, who is not afraid of responsibility for the pain he caused, and who knows how to say, you are important, not because he should, but because he feels. I don't dream about you coming back anymore, not because I don't miss you, but because I realized it's worth coming back only to those who were with you even when you didn't know what to do, who didn't leave silently, who held your hand in difficult times, even if they didn't know what to say. That wasn't the case with you, and now it won't be. But now there is me. The real me, maybe a little tired, but strong, whole, with a warm pain inside that no longer screams. I believe again, not in fairy tales, but in myself. I smile when I walk down the street. I know how to be alone and not feel lonely. And this is the most important thing I was able to take away from this whole story. I am not lost. I found myself. Thank you for leaving, because by leaving you gave me something you would never have given me, inner freedom. You broke a dream, but I built a reality. And in this reality, I am calm. I no longer hold on to ghosts. I choose air, space, the silence in which the heart can be heard. I will not send this letter. It will remain here as a farewell that I give not to you, but to myself. Because now I know, when someone leaves, it is not always a loss. Sometimes it is a beginning, my beginning. Story 6. My world was shattered in one moment when I came across a message on my boyfriend's phone. We had been together for 3 years, and I always believed that we had been through a lot, that our connection was strong as a rock. We had gone through difficult moments, quarrels, misunderstandings, but we always came back to each other. I was sure that our union was strong and sincere. And then, at one moment, when I completely did not expect it, something was revealed to me that made me doubt the very essence of our relationship. I don't usually check his phone. We've always trusted each other, and I didn't feel the need to monitor his personal correspondence. But this time, something about him had changed. He became a little withdrawn. His behavior began to seem strange. It was as if we had become a little distant from each other, but I attributed it to the fatigue and stress we'd both been experiencing lately. But something inside me told me that I should check, so I opened his phone. My gaze immediately fell on the chat with his best friend. It was strange because they had been communicating for a long time, but not in the way I imagined. I opened one of the latest correspondences, and something I could never have imagined was revealed to me. He wrote to her how the girl he met only 2 months ago brings him more peace. She calms him down, he feels harmony with her, and also, not without pleasure, he specified that this girl has big breasts. These words, big breasts, literally struck me. My heart sank, and I felt as if the ground was slipping out from under my feet. Suddenly, everything I thought about our relationship seemed like a lie. My hands shook as I scrolled down the chat. He had written that she really enjoyed being around him, and that this was something new and different for him. He had admitted that he felt comfortable with her, and he didn't want to lose that connection. I couldn't believe what I was reading. How could he say this so easily? How could he discuss me with another woman, comparing me to her, and choosing what was more about her? This wasn't just cheating, it was a series of betrayals that I couldn't understand. After all, before this, we had always talked about openness and honesty in a relationship. We talked about the importance of trusting each other, and now he seemed to be violating all of these principles openly. My eyes kept moving across the screen, but with every word I felt worse. He was writing that he wanted to have sex with this girl again. I felt sick. He was writing that he was attracted to her, and even though their relationship wasn't serious, it had become important to him. All his apologies and promises seemed like empty words. He kept swearing that he loved me, that he would work on himself, that I was the only one for him, and I believed him. I believed it despite all his ambiguities, despite all the times he hid his feelings from me. But now I was faced with the terrible truth. He had never been honest with himself or with me. As I closed my phone, my thoughts immediately raced through my head. At first, I felt angry. I couldn't believe he could do something like this. I thought I knew this man, that we had been through everything together, but it was a lie that sank into my chest like a knife. How could he have changed so much in such a short time? And why, despite all these signs, hadn't I noticed it before? I felt devastated. Fear and pain pierced me. I didn't know what to do next. But then there came a point where I tried to find answers. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to understand why he did it, why he didn't tell me sooner. Why did I have to find out through his text messages? Why couldn't I be the first one he told about his feelings, instead of hiding them behind his back? It didn't seem fair. It didn't feel right. I thought we needed to be on the same page, that our love would be based on trust and understanding, not secrets and lies. But it seemed I was wrong. I don't know how long it was before I decided to talk to him. My mind was still racing, but I needed to figure this out. I needed to understand how he could do this. I knew our conversation wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't live with this weight in my chest any longer. I knew I couldn't turn a blind eye to what I'd learned, and that it would change everything in our relationship. Even if he apologized again, even if he swears he didn't mean to hurt me, I found it hard to believe. How can you trust someone who can so easily change your perception of love and trust? That evening, I made up my mind. I had to talk to him, even though I didn't know what I would say or how it would go. But I couldn't go on living without knowing how he really felt. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to forgive him, that it would ruin everything we had. But on the other hand, I knew that if I didn't talk, if I didn't find out the truth, I wouldn't be able to live with this pain. That was the moment I realized that maybe our love wasn't as strong as I thought. And even if he came back, even if he said all the right things, I wasn't sure I could trust him again. I still remembered the moment I opened his phone and came across the message that changed my world. But what happened next was even more painful. He asked me to come back, begged me, said he was sorry. He called himself mean, said he had made a terrible mistake, and even tried to convince me that it was just a moment of weakness and that he didn't want to lose me. I felt like his words, although full of remorse, did not resonate in my heart. I knew I couldn't forgive him. I couldn't just forget how he had cheated on me. And more importantly, I couldn't forget that it wasn't the first time. Then when I told him I couldn't forgive, he threatened again that everything would fall apart, that it wouldn't be any easier for us to separate, that I would always blame myself for this breakup. I felt his words penetrating me, causing a pain that wouldn't go away. But in that moment, in that dark hour, I realized that if I stayed with him, it would only get worse. I couldn't be the one who forgave all his antics and lies again. I couldn't be his comfortable support, his constant goodbye wall. When I told him I wasn't coming back, that I needed time to sort out my feelings, he started blaming me for not giving him a chance to fix things. He said that if I was willing to open up to him, we could fix things. But it was clear to me that this was another manipulative move to get me back into the game, to keep me around without giving me space to heal. I felt like his words had lost all power. He was just another person in my life who could change everything I thought about us, about him, about what we were building. When I got home, I felt completely empty. It was as if the world around me had gone dim, and my thoughts had become a vicious circle. I knew I needed time to process what had happened. I tried not to look at my emotions, not to delve into the feelings that were still racing through my head, but they would catch up with me in quiet moments. When I sat alone, when I started thinking about what he had said, about what I had read, all these fragments of thoughts would come back to me. How could he so easily say that he wanted to go back to the girl he said brought him peace? How could he continue to build a relationship with someone else when he swore he loved me? This contrast, these words that seemed so plausible but turned out to be just a lie, tore at my soul. I tried to block him out. I wanted my thoughts to clear so I could start my life again without him. I didn't know how to get over this betrayal, how to survive without drowning in this swamp of disappointment and pain. Every morning I woke up with the feeling that I couldn't forget, like his voice was still in my head, his promises about how he would change, how he would work on himself. I couldn't shake the thought that all of this was manipulation, an attempt to get me back into his life so that I could become the woman he wanted me to be again. But I couldn't be that woman anymore. Every day it became more and more difficult for me to cope with what had happened. I tried to distract myself. I went into work. I did my own thing, but inside I felt this damn feeling of betrayal that was haunting me. I called my friends. I tried to talk to them about what had happened, but in fact I couldn't share it with them completely. It was as if all the words I could say lost their meaning. I couldn't find the right words to describe what I was feeling because I myself couldn't understand what was happening inside me. I tried to return to my usual rhythm of life, but something about it became impossible. How could I just return to normal life when I felt like something that seemed eternal was being destroyed inside me? I realized that I needed to move on, but the question was how to do it, how to learn to live after such a betrayal, how to forget the person who was there for so long and in one moment destroyed everything, how to forget the promises that sounded so sincere and which turned out to be just empty words. Every day felt like a battle with myself. I tried to fool myself, thinking that maybe if I just pretended everything was the same, if I didn't question it, things would get easier. But it didn't work. I knew I needed more than just temporary distractions. I needed time to find the strength to move on. But how? How do I leave him in the past? How do I forget about the person who's still in my head, but who shouldn't be in my life? I tried to find the answers within myself, and that was the hardest part. Eventually, I realized that trying to go back in time wouldn't help. I had to let go. It wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't a moment of clarity where everything became clear. It was a long process of learning to forgive myself for believing the lies for so long, and for staying with him despite all the signs that he wasn't being honest with me. Every morning started the same way, waking up with a dull lump in my chest, as if the night had erased everything I had worked for during the day. It felt like I was starting over every day, faced with the question, why? Why did he do this? Why to her? Why to me? These questions didn't require answers. They were like background noise in your head that wouldn't turn off. They just kept happening. I didn't know how long this process would take. I thought it should have gone faster. People around me said, time heals. But I didn't want time to heal. I wanted it to turn back, or at least disappear, so I could not feel. I often returned to the day when everything was revealed. How I sat on the bed, holding the phone with his correspondence in my hands. The words he wrote to another woman were harsh, heartless. The description of her body, how calm he felt next to her, how he doesn't feel you anymore. These phrases were nails, each one, into my chest. It's not that I didn't guess. His coldness, his strange alienation, how he began to withdraw into himself. But I clung, I hoped, and now I was paying for it. He said I was exaggerating, that I was making a mountain out of a molehill, that he had nothing with her, that it was just thoughts. But he didn't understand. I was reading something that wasn't meant for me. It wasn't just thoughts. It was a betrayal without the body, but with the soul. He betrayed me internally. He planned, imagined, lusted. I was not in his thoughts. I was outside of them. The first month after the breakup, I didn't live. I existed. I ate to keep from dying. I slept to forget. I worked automatically, like a shadow of myself. I smiled at my friends, but there was emptiness inside. Sometimes it seemed like I was just a shell, and the real me died the moment I read that correspondence. Meanwhile, he lived. He started dating her. I found out about it by chance through a mutual friend. And then came another blow, just a few weeks after he begged me to stay, calling me the only one. And now, a playlist on Apple Music, her name in the title. Love songs he used to play for me. He just shifted everything onto the new woman, like I was temporary, like we never existed. But I still called, wanted to understand, wanted to hear that he regretted it after all, wanted to hear the truth. Sometimes I thought that if he said, yes, I was an asshole, I would feel better. He didn't say that. He was angry, accused me of being intrusive, said that I was complicating everything. One day I came to him, simply because I couldn't sit at home anymore. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I didn't make a scene. I just stood there, and he said horrible things. He said I was his karma, that my presence was his punishment, that he knew I would come. He looked at me like I was a curse, not like the woman he loved. He even said he'd give me a knife if it would make me feel better. I didn't cry. I was too stunned. It wasn't him anymore. Or maybe he was the real him. I just didn't want to see it before. I left there with the feeling that something inside me had finally died. Not the feeling for him, but the faith. The faith that people love me honestly, that someone can protect my heart. I realized love is not only warmth. Sometimes it is blindness, dependence, fear of being alone. And then I decided that I wanted to learn to be myself, only myself, without the need for another person to feel whole. I started writing a diary, not to analyze, but to get everything that was inside out. Sometimes I would just write, I'm in pain, several times. Sometimes whole pages of farewells. I wrote letters to him that I would never send. I wrote to myself. I used words to pull myself out into the light. Every day it became a little easier for me. Not like in the movies where the heroine suddenly starts a new life. It was a hard road, but I noticed I no longer checked if he was online. I stopped looking for her on social networks. I did not remember her breasts that he wrote about. I stopped comparing because suddenly I understood. I am not what I have or do not have. I am everything he lost, and he knows it, even if he does not admit it. I can't say that I've forgiven him. Not yet. But I've stopped holding the poison inside. I realized that he destroyed something in me, but he can't stop me from building it anew. Better. Cleaner. Without him. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was stuck in an endless corridor of memories. Wherever I found myself, in a cafe, at a bus stop, even just in my kitchen, something always reminded me of him. His favorite coffee. His way of rolling up his sleeves. His words that once seemed kind, but now were remembered with bitterness, like poison under a sweet shell. I began to notice how much of my life was connected to him. It seemed like my entire identity was built around his presence, his tastes, his preferences, his habits. Even my favorite movies no longer seemed like they were mine. We watched them together. Even the playlist I put on my headphones resembled his laughter, his voice, his hands. And I understood. I needed to get myself back, reflash my reality, not erase the past. It was there. It's mine. But stop living in it. I decided to start small. I deleted old photos, not in a fit of anger, but calmly, one by one. Some were easy to delete. Others took me 10 minutes to sit over, as if I was tearing off a piece of skin. But I still deleted them. I changed the bed linen, bought a new mirror, rearranged the books. Anything to stop smelling him in the apartment, even if it was just the smell of memories. I aired the bedroom until it was cold, to drive away the warmth that was no longer mine. I didn't want to fight the memory, I just wanted to make space for myself. Some nights were tough, especially the ones where it seemed like progress was coming, but all it took was one trigger, and you were back on your knees on broken glass. I had a dream once. He came to me, hugged me, and said he was sorry. I woke up in tears and walked around in a daze all day. I was angry at myself for that dream, for the fact that even in my subconscious, my soul hadn't let go yet. But then I thought, this is also part of healing. The soul brings out what is hidden deepest. I started walking alone more often. I would just leave the house and walk, without a destination. Sometimes I would walk for 3 hours through the city. Sometimes I would go into a bookstore, just to smell the paper. Sometimes I would sit in a park and watch people pass by. It was strangely liberating to be invisible, unrecognized, unwanted. But for the first time, it wasn't scary. It gave me space to breathe. One day, passing by a coffee shop, I went in there for the first time without him. I always thought I couldn't. It was our place. But now I was sitting there alone, with a cup of strong latte, a new notebook and pen, and for the first time, I didn't feel empty. Just a slight sadness, like a shadow from a past rain on dry asphalt. I started writing. Not just a diary, but texts, stories, fragments of thoughts. Not even for someone, just for myself. I wasn't a writer, but the words were flowing. From within, as if I had finally found the language of pain. I realized that words are also a way of survival. Paper became my listener. It didn't interrupt, didn't blame, didn't justify. It just accepted. Sometimes I thought about her, about that girl, not with hatred, but with some strange sympathy. She had become part of this game of his too. Perhaps she believed his words. Perhaps she thought he was pure, that he truly loved her. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. But with every new thought about it, I felt the anger go away. Only fatigue remained, deep, like after an illness. I realized that I didn't want to know how he was doing anymore. I didn't want to leaf through his pages. I didn't want to ask mutual friends, because every bit of information was a step back. I stopped waiting for him to regret it, to come back, to realize it. I no longer needed his realization. I needed my own peace. I wanted to regain control over myself. I wanted to belong to myself. And even though I still fell sometimes, even though I still woke up at night worried, even though I still caught myself replaying conversations from the past, all the same, I knew now, this wasn't forever. This was just a wave, and there would definitely be a lull after it. Not quickly, not right away, but there would be. I started to rebuild my life in small steps, not to prove to him that I could, but because I didn't want to be in his shadow anymore. I wasn't his shadow. I was me, whole, valuable, alive. At some point, I stopped looking at the calendar. The days passed, the weeks followed one another, and I no longer tried to count the time since the betrayal. It seemed that the more I kept the date of the breakup in my head, the more I felt like I was living in his past and not in my present. I needed to stop waiting for the pain to pass on schedule. It was a strange feeling, as if I was simultaneously recovering and still sick. In the morning, I would feel light, and in the evening, fall back into heaviness, as if someone had thrown a wet blanket over my shoulders. But with each passing day, I understood more and more. The hardest thing is not letting him go. It is allowing myself to no longer hold it all inside, not to be afraid to be alive, and not to be afraid to be without him. I didn't regret finding out the truth. Even though it had torn my footing and left me completely alone, I knew it would have been worse to continue living in an illusion. His words, his fake remorse, his promises to be better, none of it meant anything anymore. And how quickly he'd gone to her, how easily he'd erased what we had. That wasn't my weakness, that was his nature. He'd just shown it later. Sometimes I'd sit in silence, thinking about how easily he'd called my pain drama and my love attachment. It was like an invalidation of my reality, as if everything I'd felt was just an exaggeration. I'd remember him telling me I didn't know how to let go, that I needed to outgrow my emotions, but now I knew he simply didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. My therapist told me then that real trauma is not from being betrayed, but from not being allowed to acknowledge the pain, from being forced to doubt your feelings, and I felt how true that was. How many times I had replayed the situation in my head, trying to understand if maybe I really was overreacting, demanding too much, feeling too much. But no, I was just being honest. And it wasn't the feelings that hurt, but the fact that they were rejected. I began to go out of town more often. Sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend. Not in search of a new experience, but in search of silence. Nature healed in its own way. Cold air, fog over the lake, the rustling of trees. There, among those sounds, I felt my thoughts slow down, my breathing deepen. How that obsessive circle of questions went away. Why? What's wrong with me? What did he choose in her? All those questions made no sense. The answers would be meaningless. He simply chose. He simply left. And it was about him, not about me. One day during these trips, I stayed in a small house near the forest. There was no connection, no internet, no signal, just me and nature. The first 24 hours were unsettling, like I'd lost control. But on the second, I suddenly realized how liberating it was. I lay down in a chair by the window, covered myself with a blanket, and just looked out at the rain. No thoughts, no memories, no need to be strong. I just was. It was there, in that wilderness, that I first felt myself letting go. Not abruptly, not suddenly, but deeply, as if from within. As if someone had pulled a rusty nail out of an old board, and the pain had receded with it. I hadn't forgotten. But I no longer cringed inside at his name. I no longer felt like I was being carried away by a wave. I simply allowed myself to be, without him, for myself. When I returned home, I began to live differently. Not demonstratively, not with the slogans, "I am strong," but quietly, consciously. I stopped waiting for someone to appreciate my resilience. My strength was not in enduring, but in no longer living in anticipation of pain. I unsubscribed from everyone who reminded me of it. I did not hold a grudge. I simply chose peace for myself. I began to laugh more often, not because everything became easy, but because I allowed myself to live. I understood that there was still a lot ahead, that there would be moments of weakness, new questions, perhaps new fears, but now I knew I would cope because I was already coping, not for someone else, not to show off, but because I deserved it. Sometimes I still woke up in the middle of the night and felt the emptiness that remained after he left, but I no longer tried to fill it with anything. I looked at the ceiling, breathed, and accepted. Yes, this is there, but it is temporary, like everything in this world, including pain. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want him to feel bad. I just wanted peace, and peace began to return, slowly, drop by drop. But every drop was mine. I didn't know what had changed, but one morning I woke up and didn't feel heavy. There was no pain in my chest, no wistful glance at my phone, no desire to return in a dream to a time when everything still seemed real. It was just morning, ordinary, bright, without tragedy, without him. I didn't think this day would ever come. Not because I didn't believe in healing, but because I had lived in a state of loss for too long. It had become a part of me, as if I wore it on myself, like clothes I was used to. But now in this new day, I realized you can step out of it. You can be yourself again, not the one he broke, but the one you survived. I no longer remembered every little thing. I didn't replay scenes of betrayal. I didn't try to mentally remake the past. It all remained where it belonged, in the past. And I didn't want to drag it out. Let it lie. Let it rot without me. I laughed more often with friends, not because I pretended to be happy, but because I truly caught moments of ease. I could listen to music and not think about how we danced to it. I could walk the same streets and not feel my heart burn with memories. The city was no longer its shadow. It was mine again. One day I met him by chance. We crossed paths at the entrance to a cafe. He came out, I went in. Our gazes met, and for the first time in all this time, I didn't look away. Nothing moved inside. No pain, no anger, just emptiness, as if I were looking at an acquaintance with whom I once sat in the same school. And he felt it. He froze for a second, as if waiting for a reaction, and I walked past. Not because I wanted to show indifference, but because it was real. I didn't know how his life turned out after that. I didn't follow. I wasn't interested. Not out of pride, but because it no longer mattered. He became a background, a former detail of my story. Not the main character, not even a villain, just a passerby on whom I once bet too much. Then spring came. I noticed that I wanted changes. Small but important. I repainted the walls in the bedroom, bought new bed linen, changed the scent of perfume. Not to erase the past, but to create my present. There was something profound about it. Like I was taking back control. Not of him, of myself. I started looking at myself in the mirror more often. Not to see fatigue, not traces of sleepless nights, not what I had been through, but my eyes. Real, alive, mine. With that very sparkle that I was afraid of losing forever. It came back, because I came back. People started to notice. Someone said, "You've become lighter." Someone said, "You're shining again." And I thanked them, not knowing what to say. Because it was true. I wasn't trying to be better. I was just myself for the first time in a long time, without the need to be strong, without the need to prove anything. And yes, I was still afraid. I knew that my heart was not made of steel, that there would be new attachments, new feelings ahead, perhaps pain again. But I was not afraid to love. I was afraid to forget how to be honest with myself. And now I knew that I would not allow myself to get lost in someone else's world again. Love no longer seemed like salvation to me. It became something quiet, calm, not a storm, not fire, but a warm light to which I would go if I wanted, without fear, without haste, without sacrifice. I no longer waited for someone to come and fix everything, because there was nothing left to fix. I became mine, whole, and that was the most valuable thing I could take away from that nightmare. Not the pain, not the lesson, but the return to myself. More time has passed than I ever thought it would take. Not a week, not a month, but an entire inner epoch. My personal winter lasting longer than spring is allowed. And yet, I have reached the end of it. Not running, not triumphantly, but slowly, with abrasions on my soul, with a tormented heart, but whole, imperfectly, but sincerely. When the pain subsided, it left behind a space. Simple, empty, without his image, without that girl, without all the why and what for. Space for me, for a long time I didn't know what to fill it with. At first I just lived, without plans, without fears. I learned not to be afraid of silence. I learned not to look for ghosts where there were no longer any. I noticed how I had changed. Not outwardly, inside, as if something had been hewn out of the old stone and remained more solid. Not rough, no, more like stable. I was no longer thrown about by memories. I could remember everything, even the evening I learned about her breasts and the peace they supposedly brought, and not burst into tears. I could remember him standing in front of me, cold, distant, and not feel destroyed. These were just facts, history, previous chapter. I started dreaming again. At first timidly, as if checking if it was allowed, then more boldly. I no longer wanted a love that made me doubt myself. I didn't want words with emptiness behind them. I didn't want promises to catch myself in a lie later. I wanted the real thing, even if it was just peace and quiet alone with myself. Sometimes I imagined what I would say to myself, broken, at the beginning of the journey. Probably nothing. I would just sit next to me, hug me, and let me talk. Because no words would have pulled me out then, only time, and the silence in which I finally heard myself. I stopped counting the days, stopped waiting for something to change. Outside of me, everything that needed to change had already happened. Not in his life, not in his relationship, in me, and that was enough. Sometimes he showed up in my dreams, not as a monster, not as love, just as someone who was. I woke up with a slight feeling of strangeness, but not pain. I no longer wondered why he betrayed me. I knew it wasn't about me. His actions were his. His lies, his choices, his weakness. For too long, I thought I could be the reason. But now I knew. The reason was in him. What I was most proud of was that I didn't take revenge. I didn't stoop to his level. I didn't text a girl. I didn't make a scene. I left with dignity, even when my soul was about to scream. Because my character is my face. I kept it, even when he dropped his. One evening, I was sitting on the balcony, drinking tea, listening to music. The same music that once made me cry. But now it sounded different. Not like a reminder, but like a release. The music remained, but he did not. The music was mine, and he was just an episode. I remembered how he once said that he could not be with me because he felt guilty, said that my presence made him feel ashamed, and I thought then that it was a confession. Now I know it was an escape, because it is easy to love when everything is perfect. It is harder to stay and deal with the consequences. He chose the easy. I chose the truth. Since then, I have become better at choosing people. I have stopped clinging to those who do not hold my hand. I have stopped justifying weakness with fear and calling lies an attempt to protect. If someone hurts and calls it love, it is not love. It is weakness covered up with words. At some point, I forgave him, not for his sake, for my sake, because anger is a chain, and I did not want to be tied to him in any way anymore. I let him go, and it became easier. Now I do not have someone new. And you know, it is good, because for the first time I am at peace with myself. I do not miss him. I do not miss us. I miss myself, the one I was before him, and I think I am getting her back. I no longer try to understand how he could leave so easily. I know the one who truly loves does not leave like that. The one who respects does not compare you to another. The one who is ready to fight, fights, and does not write songs to someone else's girl. He left not because I was not enough, but because he was never ready for a real woman, for an honest, direct, loving, for someone who knows how to feel and speak, for someone who sees right through. He chose the simple. I stayed with myself, and this is a victory. Quiet, personal, but real. Story 7. Resto Rebrasso Winter and 2.